Welcome to the channel. We are grateful to have you joining this peaceful space. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe, activate the bell icon, and leave a gentle comment with your thoughts or requests for future stories. Now, settle in, relax your shoulders, and let the soothing rhythm of this journey carry you toward a peaceful night's sleep. Please close your eyes, get comfortable, and let your breathing slow down. Feel the weight of your body gently sinking into the bed, as if the mattress were a quiet shore and you are slowly resting along a calm riverbank. The story of Atlantis begins quietly, without waves, without ruins, without any sense of catastrophe. It begins instead in a place of shade and measured voices, among stone columns and slow footsteps, where time seems to move more carefully than elsewhere. In ancient Athens, long before Atlantis became a word associated with loss and mystery, it existed only as an idea shaped by conversation, not shouted, not proclaimed, but spoken calmly, as though it were something remembered rather than invented. Plato does not present Atlantis as a discovery. He does not describe explorers finding submerged walls or sailors encountering strange remnants at sea. Instead, he introduces the story as something already old, already distant, passed from voice to voice across generations. This distance is important. It softens the edges of the narrative and allows it to settle into the mind like a half-remembered dream, something that feels meaningful even before it feels real. The setting is a gathering of men engaged in thoughtful dialogue. They are not historians, and they are not witnesses. They are thinkers, concerned with order, virtue, and the structure of a good society. Atlantis appears not as a subject in itself, but as an example, a story offered to illuminate a larger idea. From the very beginning, it exists in a space between memory and instruction. The account is spoken by Critias, who does not claim personal knowledge. He tells the story as something inherited, something entrusted to him. Critias explains that he heard it as a child from his grandfather, who had heard it from his own grandfather, who in turn had learned it from Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens. This long chain of transmission stretches backward through time, each link adding distance, and with distance, authority. The story is old not because it can be proven, but because it has endured. Solon, according to this account, learned of Atlantis during his travels in Egypt. He was already an old man then, curious, respected, and known for his wisdom. In the city of Sais, he spoke with Egyptian priests, men who considered Greek history to be young and incomplete. They told Solon that the Greeks were like children, always beginning again, forgetting what came before. Egypt, they said, remembered more. Within the temples of Egypt, records were kept that extended far beyond the reach of Greek memory. These records spoke of cycles of destruction and renewal, of floods and fires that had erased civilizations and left only fragments behind. It was there, among these accounts of deep time, that Solon was told of a powerful island civilization that had once existed far to the west. The priests described Atlantis not as a myth, but as a former reality. It had been strong, wealthy, and confident in its power. It had controlled lands beyond itself, and had turned its attention toward conquest. Long ago, they said, Atlantis had challenged the ancient ancestors of Athens, and Athens, still virtuous and uncorrupted, had resisted and prevailed. Shortly afterward, in a single day and a single night, Atlantis was destroyed, swallowed by the sea. This image is brief, but enduring. A single day, a single night, no lingering decline, no gradual fading. The story does not dwell on the catastrophe itself. There are no screams, no collapsing towers described in detail. The destruction is stated plainly, almost gently, as if the event were too large to be narrated directly. What matters is not how Atlantis fell, but that it did. Plato places this account at the beginning of a dialogue concerned with the structure of the cosmos and the nature of an ideal state. Atlantis, therefore, is not introduced as an isolated curiosity. It is positioned as a contrast, a mirror held up to Athens itself. Ancient Athens, in this telling, represents balance, discipline, and restraint. Atlantis represents abundance without limit, power without sufficient wisdom. From the start, the listener is invited to compare rather than to investigate. The question is not, where was Atlantis, but what happens to a society when its character changes? Atlantis becomes a symbol through which this question can be explored without directly accusing Plato's own city. By placing the story far away in time and space, Plato creates a safe distance from which uncomfortable truths can be examined. The fact that Atlantis appears only in Plato's dialogues is not hidden or disguised. There is no claim that others recorded the same story independently. Instead, Plato embeds it within his philosophical work, allowing it to function as both narrative and illustration. This choice shapes everything that follows. Atlantis is never presented as raw history. It is history filtered through purpose. The story's origin in Egypt is also significant. To Greek audiences, Egypt represented antiquity, stability, and continuity. By anchoring the tale in Egyptian records, Plato gives it weight without demanding proof. Egypt stands for memory itself, for the idea that knowledge can survive destruction if it is carefully preserved. Whether or not such records ever existed becomes secondary to what they represent. Atlantis, in this first whisper, is still undefined. Its geography is vague, its culture only hinted at. What we are given instead is a framework, a lost civilization, a moral contrast, and a warning encoded in narrative form. The emphasis is not on marvels, but on memory. The story asks the listener to slow down and consider how civilizations remember themselves and what they choose to forget. There is also an important sense of incompleteness. Plato never finished the dialogue that promised to describe Atlantis in full. The account breaks off, leaving gaps that later generations would attempt to fill. But even in this incompletion, there is a quiet appropriateness. Atlantis itself is unfinished, submerged, inaccessible. The story mirrors its subject. In this opening movement, Atlantis is not yet the city of shining walls or vast harbors. It is an echo, barely formed. It exists as a recollection carried across centuries, shaped by voices rather than by stone. Its power lies not in detail, but in implication. It suggests that greatness can be lost, that memory is fragile, and that virtue, once abandoned, is difficult to recover. As the dialogue continues, the listener is prepared for something larger, more detailed, and more vivid. But the foundation has already been laid. Atlantis has been framed not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a lesson to be contemplated. It enters the world quietly, through philosophy rather than spectacle, inviting reflection rather than belief. And so, before there are concentric rings, before there are kings and armies, before there is wealth beyond measure, Atlantis exists first as a question about time, a question about memory, and most of all, a question about what it means for a civilization to endure. As the story of Atlantis continues to hover at the edge of thought, it becomes clear that its power does not come from immediacy. Nothing in its opening rushes forward. Everything is layered, separated by distance, softened by time. This distance is not a weakness of the tale, but its condition. Atlantis is meant to be heard as something remote, filtered through memory, because it speaks most clearly when it is not pressed too close to the present. Plato's choice to present the story through multiple generations is deliberate. Each retelling introduces a pause, a moment of quiet uncertainty, where certainty dissolves into reflection. Critias remembers hearing the story as a boy, not fully understanding it, sensing only that it was important. This detail matters. It tells the listener that Atlantis is not a fact to be mastered, but an idea to grow into slowly, much like wisdom itself. In this way, Atlantis enters the dialogue already aged. It carries the weight of something preserved rather than discovered. The story does not demand belief. It invites attention. It settles into the mind the way distant thunder does, not loud enough to startle, but persistent enough to be noticed. The Egyptian priests play a crucial role in shaping this atmosphere. They do not speak as missionaries of truth, eager to convince. They speak as custodians of memory, almost weary in their certainty that civilizations forget themselves. Their message to Solon is gentle, but firm. Destruction has happened before, and it will happen again. Floods erase cities. Fires erase records. Survivors begin again, unaware of what once existed. This cyclical understanding of history contrasts sharply with the Greek sense of progress and achievement. By placing Atlantis within an Egyptian worldview, Plato introduces the idea that human societies are not moving steadily upward, but drifting through repeating patterns of rise and loss. Atlantis becomes one such rise, one such loss, neither unique nor accidental. The priest's tone is not tragic, it is calm. Atlantis is not mourned, it is remembered. This calmness permeates the entire narrative and sets the emotional register for what follows. The story is not meant to provoke fear, but awareness. Not panic, but contemplation. Solon's role in this chain is also telling. He is a lawgiver, a reformer, someone concerned with the structure of society and the limits of power. He hears the story of Atlantis not as entertainment, but as instruction. Yet he never completes the poem he intended to write about it. The story remains unfinished, suspended, as if resisting transformation into heroic epic. This incompletion echoes forward, Plato inherits not a polished narrative, but a fragment, something still open. He chooses not to close it. Instead, he places it within dialogue, where ideas remain in motion, never fixed. Atlantis is allowed to remain partially undefined because definition would reduce its usefulness as a philosophical tool. At this early stage, Atlantis is described only in contrast. It is powerful where Athens is measured. It is expansive where Athens is contained. These oppositions are quiet but firm. The listener is guided toward comparison without being told what to think. This restraint is central to the story's effectiveness. Ancient Athens, as presented here, is not the city Plato lived in. It is an idealized past, shaped to embody virtues that Plato believed his contemporaries had lost. By placing Athens in the distant past, just like Atlantis, Plato removes both societies from the present moment. This creates a balanced space where judgment can occur without defensiveness. Atlantis, then, is not simply the bad civilization. It begins as something admirable, even enviable. Its later corruption is meaningful only because its earlier state was noble. This is important. Plato is not warning against greatness. He is warning against greatness without restraint. The absence of vivid detail at this point allows the listener's imagination to remain open. Atlantis could be anywhere. It could be anything. This openness is not accidental. A fully described city would anchor the story too firmly. Instead, Atlantis remains a shape, an outline, waiting to be filled later. The phrase describing its end, in a single day and a single night, is repeated not for drama, but for rhythm. It has the quality of ritual speech, almost like a refrain. It compresses time, reminding the listener that what takes centuries to build can vanish almost instantly. This is not presented as punishment, but as fact. There is no divine wrath described here, no angry gods hurling thunderbolts. The destruction feels impersonal, almost natural. This absence of moral spectacle reinforces the idea that decline carries its own consequences without requiring theatrical judgment. In this way, Atlantis is introduced as a natural outcome of imbalance rather than a supernatural exception. Its fall is not a miracle. It is a return to equilibrium. This framing aligns closely with Plato's broader philosophy, where excess inevitably invites correction. The calmness of this opening also serves another function. It creates trust. The listener is not being manipulated emotionally. There is no urgency, no demand for allegiance. The story unfolds at a pace that mirrors thoughtful reflection. This makes it suitable for contemplation and, in time, for rest. As the dialogue prepares to move toward more concrete description, the listener has already absorbed the essential premise. Civilizations are shaped by character. Memory is fragile. Power requires measure. Atlantis, before it becomes a place, has already become a principle. This principle lingers beneath the surface of the narrative, guiding everything that follows. Even when walls gleam and harbors fill with ships, the quiet warning introduced here will remain present. The listener has been prepared not to marvel blindly, but to observe carefully. By the end of this second movement, Atlantis is still distant. It has not yet risen from the sea of abstraction, but it has taken root in the mind as something both grand and fragile, something worthy of attention but not reverence. It is a story designed to be held gently, not grasped tightly, a story that does not insist on answers but invites patience, and in that patience, the true shape of Atlantis begins slowly to emerge. When Atlantis begins to take on form, it does so gradually, as if emerging from mist rather than rising sharply into view. The transition from memory to description is careful and measured. There is no sudden unveiling. Instead, the listener is guided outward, away from familiar shores, toward a place defined first by its distance. Atlantis is said to lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase that already carries weight and stillness. For the ancient listener, these pillars marked the limit of the known world, the place where mapped certainty ended and speculation began. Beyond them lay the open ocean, wide, quiet, and largely untraveled. By placing Atlantis there, the story situates itself at the edge of knowledge, where imagination is permitted to move slowly and without resistance. This location is important not only geographically, but psychologically. A land beyond the pillars cannot be easily verified or denied. It exists in a realm where listening becomes more important than measuring. The sea itself acts as a veil, separating Atlantis from ordinary experience. It is not meant to be reached. It is meant to be contemplated. The island is described as vast, larger than what the listener would naturally expect. It is not a small outpost or a lonely rock in the ocean. It is presented as expansive, capable of holding cities, plains, and mountains. This sense of scale is introduced gently, without exaggeration, allowing the mind to adjust slowly to the idea of greatness. Yet even as Atlantis grows in size, the description remains orderly. The island is not wild or chaotic. It is shaped, arranged, and measured. Nature and design appear to cooperate rather than compete. This harmony between land and intention will become one of the defining qualities of Atlantis. At the heart of the island lies its capital, and here the description becomes more precise, more rhythmic. The city is built around a series of concentric rings, alternating between land and water. These rings circle a central island, like ripples spreading outward from a single point. The image is simple and soothing, repeated patterns creating a sense of balance. Water flows gently through the city, not as a barrier, but as a connector. Channels and passages link each ring, allowing movement to occur smoothly and without strain. Boats pass quietly through these waterways, suggesting a city where travel is integrated into daily life rather than imposed upon it. The central island is not large, but it is carefully defined. Its modest size draws attention to proportion rather than excess. Around it, the rings expand outward, each one wider than the last, creating a natural progression from center to edge. This layered structure gives the city a sense of depth, both physical and symbolic. The rings serve different purposes. Some support buildings, others serve as harbors, others as protective spaces. The listener is not overwhelmed with technical detail. Instead, the emphasis remains on the feeling of a city that knows itself, that has been planned with patience rather than haste. Bridges cross the waterways at regular intervals, connecting land to land, ring to ring. These bridges are not described as grand monuments. They are functional, calm, and reliable. Their presence reinforces the idea that Atlantis values continuity and flow. Nothing is isolated. Everything connects. The water itself is described as clear and navigable. It is not turbulent or dangerous. It moves slowly, reflecting light, carrying vessels without resistance. This calmness reinforces the sense that Atlantis exists in a state of controlled abundance, where resources are plentiful and managed rather than fought over. As the description expands outward, the city reveals walls surrounding each ring. These walls are not merely defensive, they are also symbolic. Each is faced with a different metal, giving the city a layered brilliance that changes with distance and light. The outer wall gleams with a warm, earthy tone. The next reflects a cooler brightness. The innermost shines with a rare, almost otherworldly glow. These materials are mentioned without urgency, as if their value lies not in wealth alone, but in order. Each layer has its place. Each surface has its purpose. The city becomes a visual expression of hierarchy and balance, where outer strength protects inner meaning. At the very center stands the heart of Atlantis, the royal precinct and the sacred space dedicated to the sea god who watches over the island. This central place is not described as crowded or noisy. It is elevated, open, and quiet. The buildings here do not compete with one another. They coexist. The temple and palace are aligned with the city's geometry, reinforcing the sense that spiritual, political, and natural orders are intertwined. Nothing feels accidental. Everything feels placed, yet even as the description becomes richer, it remains restrained. The story does not linger excessively on decoration. It does not catalog every column or surface. Instead, it maintains a slow pace, allowing each image to settle before moving on. The effect of this description is subtle. Atlantis begins to feel real, not because it is proven, but because it is coherent. Its design follows a logic that feels calm and intentional. The listener is not dazzled into disbelief. They are eased into acceptance. This coherence is essential. Atlantis must feel possible before it can feel meaningful. The city's structure reflects a mind that values order, proportion, and continuity. It suggests a society that has not yet lost its sense of measure. As the rings expand and the image grows more complete, the listener may notice something else: the absence of urgency. There is no sense of threat here, no looming danger. The city exists in a moment of equilibrium, suspended between beginning and end. This moment is important. It represents Atlantis before decline, before excess becomes hunger. The calmness of the description mirrors the calmness of the society itself, at least as it once was. By the end of this first part, Atlantis has taken shape as a place of balance and quiet grandeur. It is distant, ordered, and complete in itself. It does not demand attention. It simply exists. And in this existence, the listener is invited not to judge, but to observe, to let the image rest, to follow its curves and channels slowly without rushing ahead. The city waits, patient and still, as the story prepares to move deeper inside. As the listener moves closer to the heart of Atlantis, the city's structure begins to feel less like an arrangement of stone and water and more like a pattern carefully held in place. Nothing appears hurried. Nothing feels excessive. The city seems to breathe at a steady pace, as though it were built to endure long periods of calm rather than moments of spectacle. The walls that encircle each ring become more than boundaries. They serve as quiet markers of progression, guiding movement inward without resistance. The outermost wall stands firm and wide, designed to face the open sea. It carries a subdued warmth in its surface, catching light without reflecting it harshly. This outer layer feels practical, protective, and grounded. Moving inward, the next wall appears brighter, its surface smoother, reflecting the surrounding water in softened patterns. It does not dominate the eye. Instead, it creates a sense of transition, as though one were passing from the realm of commerce and travel into a more considered space. The city seems to invite this movement, encouraging reflection rather than haste. The innermost wall is different. It is not merely brighter, but quieter in its brilliance. Its surface reflects light evenly, without glare, producing a steady glow that feels contained. This wall does not announce power. It suggests stability. It stands not to impress those outside, but to protect what lies within. Inside this final ring, the atmosphere changes. Sound seems muted. The movement of water slows further, and the architecture becomes more open. Buildings are spaced generously, allowing air and light to circulate freely. There is no sense of crowding, no impression of competition for space. At the center rises the sacred precinct, where the spiritual and civic life of Atlantis converge. The temple dedicated to the sea, God occupies a prominent position, yet it does not overshadow its surroundings. It is large, but proportioned, tall, but not towering. Its presence is felt more through balance than through scale. The temple's surfaces are smooth and carefully finished. They reflect the sky above and the water below in gentle harmony. Decorative elements exist, but they are restrained, repeating familiar patterns rather than introducing complexity. The effect is calming. The building does not demand admiration. It invites quiet attention. Nearby stands the royal residence, positioned not above the temple, but alongside it. This placement is significant. Authority and reverence are shown as parallel rather than hierarchical. Power is not elevated above the sacred. It is placed beside it, suggesting responsibility rather than dominance. Paths connect these central structures in straight, deliberate lines. There are no winding corridors here, no hidden turns. Movement within the heart of Atlantis is direct and unambiguous. This clarity of design reflects a culture that values transparency and shared understanding. The water channels that surround the central island are narrower and calmer than those farther out. Boats pass through them slowly, guided by habit rather than instruction. There is no congestion, no urgency. Travel here feels ceremonial rather than practical. Bridges crossing these channels are simple and strong, They do not distract with ornamentation. Their function is clear, and they perform it quietly. As one crosses them, there is a sense of entering a space where behavior changes naturally without enforcement. The city's geometry reinforces this feeling. Circles repeat, distances feel measured. Nothing appears accidental. Even the open spaces seem placed with intention, allowing for gathering without encouraging noise or disorder. Beyond the central rings, the city gradually gives way to the broader island. Here, the land opens into wide plains, cultivated with care. These fields are not described as wild expanses, but as orderly stretches divided by channels that bring water evenly across the soil. Agriculture here feels like a continuation of the city's design rather than a separate activity. Roads extend outward in straight lines, connecting the capital to distant regions of the island. These roads are wide enough to support steady movement, but not so wide as to dominate the landscape. They suggest connection without conquest, movement without pressure. Harbors line the outer rings, designed to accommodate many vessels without crowding. Ships rest quietly at anchor, their presence a sign of exchange rather than invasion. Trade appears steady and continuous, not frantic or opportunistic. Warehouses and storage buildings are positioned close to the water, integrated into the city's structure. Goods flow inward and outward smoothly, guided by routine rather than force. This ease of movement reinforces the sense that Atlantis functions as a system in balance. What becomes increasingly clear is that Atlantis is not defined by any single marvel. Its wonder lies in consistency, the repetition of forms, the harmony of materials, and the alignment of function and space all contribute to a feeling of completeness. There is no emphasis on height for its own sake. Towers do not strain upward. Buildings rise only as high as necessary, maintaining a horizontal calm that keeps the sky open and unobstructed. This choice subtly communicates restraint. Even the materials used throughout the city reflect this philosophy. Metals and stone are chosen not only for durability, but for how they age. Surfaces are meant to weather slowly, to change gently over time rather than decay suddenly. The listener may sense that this city was built with long durations in mind. It does not anticipate disaster. It anticipates continuity. This expectation of endurance is part of what makes the later story of Atlantis so poignant. Yet at this stage, nothing hints overtly at decline. The city exists in equilibrium, its design supporting a way of life that values order, proportion, and shared purpose. The listener is allowed to rest in this image without interruption. Atlantis, as it appears here, is not aggressive. It does not project threat. It does not proclaim superiority. Its strength is quiet, embedded in structure rather than display. This quiet strength makes the city feel secure. It suggests a society that trusts its foundations and sees no immediate need to defend itself against change. In this confidence, there is comfort. In this comfort, there is vulnerability. But the story does not yet move toward that realization. For now, it remains within the calm boundaries of description. The city stands complete, its rings aligned, its waters flowing, its walls holding steady. The listener is invited to dwell in this moment of balance, to absorb the feeling of a place that believes it has solved the problem of order. The image lingers, unchallenged, preparing the ground for what will come later. Atlantis rests here, fully formed, radiant yet restrained, waiting silently at the center of its rings. Once the shape of Atlantis has settled into the imagination, the story turns gently away from stone and water and toward the human order that sustained the city. Power in Atlantis does not appear suddenly, nor does it dominate the narrative with forceful gestures. Instead, it reveals itself slowly through structure, repetition, and accepted custom. Authority here feels less like command and more like arrangement. Atlantis is governed not by a single ruler, but by a group of kings, each entrusted with a portion of the island. This division is not the result of conflict or compromise. It is presented as an original condition, established at the very beginning of Atlantean history. Power is shared from the start, distributed across regions in a way that appears deliberate and balanced. Each king rules a defined territory, overseeing its lands, people, and resources. These territories are not described as competing states. They are parts of a whole, connected through shared laws, shared ancestry, and shared ritual obligations. The kings are related to one another, bound by lineage as well as duty. Their authority flows from a common origin, reinforcing unity even within division. This system creates a sense of stability. No single ruler carries the weight of the entire island. Responsibility is spread, and with it, restraint. Decisions affecting Atlantis as a whole are not made by one voice, but by many voices brought together at appointed times. Governance becomes a process rather than an event. The kings do not meet constantly. Their gatherings follow a fixed rhythm, occurring at measured intervals rather than in response to crisis. This rhythm matters. It slows the pace of political life and discourages impulsive action. Time itself becomes part of the governing structure, creating space for reflection and continuity. When the rulers assemble, they do so in a sacred setting at the heart of the city. These meetings are not public spectacles. They are quiet, formal, and restrained. The atmosphere is one of deliberation rather than debate. The goal is not persuasion or dominance, but alignment with established law. At the center of these gatherings stands a pillar upon which the laws of Atlantis are inscribed. These laws are not hidden in archives or interpreted by intermediaries. They are visible, fixed, and materially present. Their permanence reminds each ruler that authority is not personal property, but a responsibility bounded by rules that cannot be altered at will. The laws themselves are ancient, inherited from the earliest period of Atlantean society. They govern relations between rulers, limits on power, and obligations toward the common good. By being inscribed rather than spoken, they resist erosion through memory or reinterpretation. They stand unchanged as generations pass. Before deliberations begin, ritual actions take place. These rituals are simple and repetitive, designed not to impress, but to remind. They reinforce the shared origin of the kings and their collective submission to law. Through ritual, governance becomes not merely administrative, but moral. The kings are expected to judge not only external matters, but themselves. Transgressions of law by rulers are addressed within the same system that governs the people. This expectation introduces accountability into the structure of power. Authority is not exempt from judgment. The residences of the kings reflect this philosophy. They are positioned close to the sacred and civic center, not elevated above it. Their proximity suggests visibility rather than separation. Rulers are present within the city's life, not withdrawn from it. Power remains close to the people it affects. Daily governance at the regional level appears calm and habitual. Laws are enforced not through fear, but through expectation. The people of Atlantis are depicted as accustomed to order. Obedience is not described as submission, but as participation in a shared framework. This acceptance suggests an alignment between law and character. The system works because it reflects values already present within the society. Laws do not feel imposed, they feel natural. This harmony is one of Atlantis's defining strengths during its early period. Yet beneath this calm structure lies an unspoken assumption that character will remain consistent across generations. Authority is inherited, and wisdom is expected to follow bloodline. This assumption is never challenged directly, but it introduces a quiet vulnerability into the system. As time passes, descendants may not embody the same restraint as their ancestors. The laws remain fixed, but interpretation depends on those who apply them. While the structure of governance appears solid, its effectiveness rests on the inner disposition of its rulers. The division of the island into regions, while initially stabilizing, also introduces distance. Local concerns may begin to outweigh shared priorities. Differences in prosperity, ambition, or outlook can develop gradually without immediate conflict. At this stage of the story, however, such tensions remain dormant. The system functions as intended. The kings gather, the rituals continue, and the laws hold. Atlantis exists within a state of political equilibrium, confident in the strength of its institutions. The listener is encouraged to observe this system patiently, without rushing toward judgment. The narrative does not condemn or praise excessively. It simply presents a structure that appears complete, balanced, and enduring. Governance in Atlantis mirrors the city's physical design. Like the concentric rings, authority moves inward and outward in measured paths. Power is contained by form, habit, and shared memory. Nothing exceeds its bounds. This is a society that believes order, once established, can sustain itself indefinitely. That belief rests quietly at the center of Atlantean life, unexamined and unquestioned. And for now, it remains intact. If the structure of Atlantean rule appears calm and enduring, it is because it is reinforced not only by law, but by habit. Governance here is not sustained through constant vigilance or fear of punishment. It is sustained through repetition. The same actions are performed, the same words are spoken, and the same procedures are followed year after year, generation after generation. Over time, these repetitions shape expectation, and expectation shapes behavior. The kings of Atlantis are raised within this rhythm. From early life, they are surrounded by the forms of authority rather than its spectacle. They learn where to stand, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Power is presented to them as something that must fit into existing patterns, not something to be expressed freely. This early conditioning reinforces restraint. Education for rulers is not described as innovative or exploratory. It is conservative in the deepest sense of the word. Knowledge is transmitted rather than reinvented. The emphasis lies on remembering how things have always been done. Wisdom is equated with continuity. This approach produces stability, but it also narrows the range of acceptable thought. When a system functions well for long periods, its assumptions begin to feel permanent. Alternatives are not debated because they are not imagined. The structure of governance becomes invisible to those who live within it. The rituals performed during the king's assemblies play a central role in maintaining this invisibility. These rituals are not dramatic or emotionally charged. They are simple, repetitive, and predictable. Their purpose is not to inspire, but to anchor. Each repetition reaffirms the legitimacy of the existing order. Through ritual, law becomes embodied. It is not merely known, it is enacted. The physical presence of the rulers, their shared actions, and their synchronized movements all contribute to the sense that governance is a natural process rather than a human construction. The sacred laws inscribed on the central pillar further reinforce this perception. Because the laws do not change, they appear to exist outside time. They are not associated with any particular ruler or decision. They seem to belong to the island itself, as though they emerged naturally from the land. This timeless quality lends the laws authority, but it also distances them from lived experience. As generations pass, circumstances shift subtly. New challenges emerge. Resources fluctuate. Populations grow. Yet the laws remain unchanged, interpreted through precedent rather than adaptation. For a long time, this rigidity causes no visible problem. The kings judge wisely. The people comply willingly. The system absorbs minor tensions without strain. Atlantis appears to have solved the problem of power by slowing it down. However, slowness carries its own risks. When change occurs gradually, it can go unnoticed. Small deviations in character do not immediately disrupt ritual or law. A ruler may be slightly less patient than his predecessor, slightly more confident in his own judgment. These differences do not break the system. They merely bend it. Inheritance plays a key role in this process. Authority passes through bloodline, not merit. While early generations may share similar dispositions, later generations inevitably diverge. The system assumes continuity of character, but character is not fixed. The children of rulers grow up surrounded by order, wealth, and security. They do not experience the uncertainty that shaped earlier generations. Their relationship to power is more comfortable, less cautious. This comfort subtly alters how authority is perceived. At first, these shifts manifest only in tone. Decisions are made more quickly. Deliberation becomes slightly less thorough. Ritual is still observed, but with less inward attention. The forms remain intact, but their meaning begins to thin. The gatherings of kings continue as before, but the space between them feels different. What was once a moment of shared reflection becomes more procedural. Alignment is assumed rather than actively sought. Agreement becomes habitual rather than deliberate. The laws, still inscribed and unchanged, begin to serve as justification rather than guidance. Rulers refer to them to support decisions already made rather than to shape decisions still in formation. This change is subtle and difficult to detect. At the regional level, differences begin to appear. Some territories grow more prosperous than others. Trade routes favor certain regions. Resources accumulate unevenly. These disparities are not yet sources of conflict, but they introduce variation into a system built on sameness. Local rulers respond differently to these conditions. Some remain restrained, mindful of balance. Others become more assertive, seeking to expand their influence or secure advantages for their own region. The system allows this variation to exist without immediate correction. The shared ancestry of the kings continues to bind them, but blood alone cannot guarantee unity of purpose. As memories of the island's founding recede further into the past, loyalty to the collective weakens slightly, replaced by loyalty to local success. Still, the rituals continue. The laws remain visible. The city functions smoothly. From the outside, Atlantis appears unchanged. This is what makes the shift so difficult to perceive. Decline does not announce itself. It settles quietly. The people of Atlantis sense these changes only faintly. Life remains comfortable. Order persists. There is no reason to question the system that has provided stability for so long. Trust in authority remains strong. Yet trust, once unquestioned, can dull attention. When obedience becomes automatic, accountability weakens. The rulers are still bound by law, but enforcement relies increasingly on self-restraint rather than collective correction. This reliance on internal discipline marks a turning point. As long as character aligns with structure, the system thrives. When character begins to drift, the system has little capacity to respond quickly. Its strength becomes its limitation. None of this is framed as failure. There is no moment where Atlantis suddenly becomes corrupt. The story does not accuse individual rulers of malice. Instead, it traces a gradual loosening, a slow widening of distance between principle and practice. The quiet architecture of power, once so carefully constructed, remains standing, but within it, movement changes. Authority flows a little more freely, encountering fewer internal boundaries. What was once contained begins, almost imperceptibly, to press outward. For now, this pressure remains internal. It has not yet transformed into ambition or expansion. It exists as possibility rather than action. The system still appears balanced, but its balance is becoming less intentional. The listener is invited to notice this shift without alarm. The story continues at its measured pace, allowing the implications to surface gently. Atlantis does not fall because of a single decision or event. It changes because it assumes it does not need to change. By the end of this part, governance in Atlantis still functions. The kings still gather. The laws still stand. The rituals still bind. But beneath the calm surface, something has begun to move. It is not yet visible in the city's walls or waters. It exists in disposition rather than structure, in confidence rather than necessity. And this, more than any external threat, will shape what comes next. The island of Atlantis is shaped not only by law and ritual, but by abundance. From its earliest days, the land provides generously. Plains stretch wide and level, bordered by low hills that break the wind and hold the rain. Rivers flow steadily from the mountains toward the sea, dividing the land into fertile segments that can be measured, irrigated, and worked with ease. This abundance is not accidental. It is the result of careful design layered upon favorable geography. Channels are cut with precision. Water is guided, slowed, and distributed rather than allowed to rush unchecked. The land responds predictably, yielding harvests that arrive on time and in sufficient quantity. For generations, this reliability shapes the Atlantean mindset. Scarcity is not a dominant concern. Survival does not occupy daily thought. Instead, attention shifts toward management, refinement, and optimization. The question is no longer whether there will be enough, but how best to use what is already available. In early periods, this mindset reinforces moderation. Because resources are stable, there is little incentive to hoard. Storage exists to guard against fluctuation, not to assert dominance. Wealth circulates through ritual obligation and communal expectation, returning again and again to shared use. The rhythm of agricultural life supports this balance. Fields are planted, tended, harvested, and rested according to cycles that are well understood. Labor is steady, not frantic. Time stretches comfortably, leaving space for craft, learning, and contemplation. The people of Atlantis come to see order as natural. The land behaves, the seasons behave, and society behaves. This harmony reinforces confidence in the structures that govern daily life. When everything works, the assumption grows that it will continue to work. As generations pass, techniques improve, tools become more efficient, storage systems expand, surpluses increase. What was once simply sufficient becomes plentiful. What was plentiful becomes impressive. This increase in surplus does not immediately disrupt balance. Instead, it creates new opportunities. Artisans specialize. Builders experiment with scale and ornamentation. Metals are worked more finely. Stone is cut more precisely. Public spaces become larger, more elaborate, more permanent. These developments are celebrated. They are seen as signs of refinement, not excess. Beauty and functionality are not viewed as opposites. The city grows outward and upward in a way that feels measured and intentional. Trade follows naturally. Surplus goods are exchanged with neighboring regions, first nearby, then farther away. Ships travel more frequently. Harbors expand to accommodate increased movement. The sea, once a boundary, becomes a pathway. Trade brings variety. New materials arrive. New techniques are observed. New customs are encountered. These influences are absorbed selectively, filtered through existing norms and practices. Atlantis does not feel threatened by difference. It feels enriched by it. At this stage, expansion remains economic rather than political. Influence spreads through exchange rather than force. Other regions benefit from Atlantean goods and knowledge. The relationship feels mutual, yet trade subtly alters perception. When Atlanteans see their goods valued elsewhere, they begin to see themselves differently. Their land is not just fertile, it is exceptional. Their systems are not just functional, they are superior. This sense of distinction does not yet become arrogance. It remains internal, a quiet confidence. But confidence, when unchallenged, can shift into expectation. Expectation can become entitlement. The abundance that once encouraged moderation now enables choice. With choice comes preference. With preference comes comparison. Some goods are favored over others. Some lifestyles are admired more than others. Gradually, distinctions form. Wealth, once distributed broadly, begins to cluster. Certain regions, better positioned for trade or production, accumulate more resources. Certain families become known for craftsmanship or commerce. These differences are acknowledged, though not yet contested. The governing structures remain unchanged. Laws still apply equally. Rituals still bind rulers and regions together, but lived experience becomes less uniform. Daily life in one area begins to feel subtly different from life in another. At first, these differences are aesthetic. Homes vary in size and decoration. Clothing becomes more expressive. Public spaces in wealthier regions are adorned with finer materials. These changes are accepted as natural outcomes of productivity. Over time, they begin to influence behavior. Those with greater resources enjoy greater leisure. They host gatherings, commission works, and sponsor projects. Their visibility increases. Influence follows visibility. The idea of merit shifts quietly. Achievement becomes associated not only with service or restraint, but with display. The ability to produce visible results gains social weight. Excellence is increasingly measured by output rather than alignment with tradition. This shift does not break the system, it bends it. The values that once emphasized balance now coexist with values that reward expansion. Both are present, and for a time, they do not openly conflict. The rulers observe these changes. Some see opportunity in growth and diversification. Others sense unease, but lack a clear reason to intervene. The system has always absorbed change. Why would it not continue to do so? The laws do not prohibit expansion. They regulate behavior, not aspiration. As long as rituals are observed and assemblies held, governance appears intact. There is no mechanism designed to question desire itself. As trade routes extend farther, contact increases. Atlantean ships travel beyond familiar waters. They encounter societies organized differently, some less stable, some less abundant. The contrast is striking. These encounters reinforce a sense of capability. Atlantis is not merely successful within its own context, it appears advanced relative to others. The idea of responsibility emerges alongside the idea of superiority. At first, responsibility is framed generously. Assistance is offered, knowledge is shared. Atlantean systems are admired and sometimes adopted elsewhere. Influence grows without coercion, but influence changes relationships. Where once there was exchange, there is now dependence. Some regions come to rely on Atlantean goods or protection. This reliance subtly shifts power dynamics. The language used to describe these relationships evolves. Partners become clients. Assistance becomes oversight. Oversight becomes authority. Each step feels small, reasonable, even benevolent. Within Atlantis, These developments are celebrated as success. Expansion is not yet conquest, but it is moving in that direction. The boundary between cooperation and control grows thinner. The people, still comfortable and well fed, largely approve. Prosperity continues. There is little incentive to question the direction of growth. The city gleams, the harbors bustle, the fields remain fertile. Yet the internal experience of abundance has changed. What was once enough is no longer enough. Desire stretches forward, always finding a new horizon. This is not framed as greed. It is framed as potential. Why stop when more is possible? Why limit a system that seems capable of endless expansion? The story does not condemn these questions. It simply places them in sequence. Abundance leads to confidence. Confidence leads to expansion. Expansion introduces imbalance. At this stage, imbalance remains manageable. Structures hold. Rituals continue. Laws are observed. But the center of gravity has shifted slightly. Atlantis still appears harmonious. Its decline, if it can be called that, has not begun in disaster or conflict. It has begun in comfort. The listener is invited to notice how quietly this happens. No boundary is crossed in a single step. Each change feels justified by success. By the end of this part, Atlantis stands at a threshold it does not yet recognize. The land is still generous. The people are still orderly. The rulers still gather in ritual. But abundance, once a foundation for balance, has become a force that gently presses outward. And what presses outward will eventually test the limits of what can contain it. As abundance continues to shape the life of Atlantis, its influence extends beyond fields and harbors and into thought itself. Prosperity, once experienced as stability, slowly becomes expectation. What was previously welcomed as fortune begins to feel like entitlement. Though this change happens without declaration or debate, the people of Atlantis still live within order, but their sense of what order requires subtly expands. Comfort becomes normal. Ease becomes assumed. Effort is measured not by necessity, but by comparison with what has already been achieved. This shift alters motivation without announcing itself. Trade routes lengthen further. Ships no longer travel only with goods meant for exchange, but also with representatives meant to observe, negotiate, and assess. Knowledge gathered from distant lands is brought back, cataloged, and discussed. The world beyond Atlantis grows more familiar, and therefore less mysterious. With familiarity comes evaluation. Other societies are measured against Atlantean standards of organization, productivity, and refinement. Differences that were once seen as variation are now interpreted as deficiency. Atlantis begins to imagine itself as a reference point rather than a participant. This change does not initially lead to aggression. It manifests instead as guidance. Atlantean advisors offer counsel to foreign leaders. Systems of record keeping, irrigation, and governance are shared. These offers are framed as gifts and often received as such, but gifts create obligations. Those who receive assistance become dependent on continued support. Over time, guidance becomes expectation. Expectation becomes leverage. The boundary between help and control grows thinner with each exchange. Within Atlantis, these developments are discussed with calm approval. There is little dissent. Expansion brings wealth, resources, and prestige without visible cost. The system appears capable of absorbing growth indefinitely. The governing councils adapt their discussions accordingly. Matters once focused inward now increasingly concern external affairs. Borders, alliances, and maritime security take up more time. The language of defense begins to appear alongside the language of trade. Naval fleets expand not only to protect commerce, but to ensure stability in regions now tied to Atlantean interests. Shipyards work continuously. Sailors become a more prominent presence in public life. The sea is no longer merely a connector. It is a domain to be managed. This increased military capacity is justified carefully. It is described as necessary, preventive, and stabilizing. Force is framed as a last resort, even as preparations for its use become routine. The people accept this logic. They have little reason not to. Their lives remain comfortable. Public works continue. Festivals are held. The city shines. Yet the distribution of attention changes. More resources are allocated to fleets, fortifications, and external infrastructure. Less attention is given to the subtle maintenance of internal balance. No crisis demands immediate correction, so imbalance is tolerated. At the regional level, governors and officials gain increased authority to act quickly in distant territories. Distance necessitates discretion. Discretion grants autonomy. Autonomy, over time, reshapes accountability. Decisions once made collectively are now made locally in the name of efficiency. Reports replace presence. Summaries replace shared experience. The rhythm of governance accelerates. The laws remain unchanged, but their application adapts to new circumstances. Exceptions are made. Interpretations widen. Flexibility is praised as pragmatism. Ritual gatherings of the kings still occur, but their tone evolves. Assemblies once focused on reflection and judgment now emphasize strategy and coordination. The pillar of laws stands unchanged, yet attention shifts away from it toward maps and reports. This shift does not eliminate reverence, but it redistributes it. Success becomes its own form of validation. Outcomes are valued over principles, provided those outcomes align with Atlantean interests. As generations pass, those who inherit power grow up within this expanded world. They know Atlantis not as a balanced island, but as a center of influence. Their understanding of responsibility includes dominance as a given. Education reflects this reality. Training emphasizes administration, logistics, and command. Moral instruction remains present, but it is increasingly abstract, less connected to daily decision-making. The concept of restraint becomes harder to define. When power has not yet encountered meaningful resistance, limitation feels unnecessary. The idea of stopping expansion seems irrational, even irresponsible. Meanwhile, wealth continues to accumulate unevenly. Those connected to trade, shipping, and administration prosper most. Social distinctions become more visible, though still politely unacknowledged. Public spaces grow grander. Architecture becomes more monumental. Scale itself becomes a language, communicating permanence and authority. The city's appearance reflects its ambitions. The people take pride in this transformation. Visitors marvel at the capital. Stories spread. Atlantis becomes legendary even within its own time. Yet beneath admiration lies quiet fatigue. The systems that once felt simple now require constant maintenance. Coordination grows complex. Oversight stretches thin. Signals of strain appear, though they are subtle. Delays in communication, misaligned priorities, local disputes that require intervention. None of these are alarming on their own, because no single moment defines the change. It remains unnamed. Atlantis does not recognize itself as having crossed a threshold. It believes it is still becoming what it has always been. The idea of limits fades. The sea seems endless. Resources appear abundant. Influence expands with little resistance. The world responds predictably to Atlantean initiative. This predictability reinforces confidence. Confidence hardens into assumption. Assumption becomes doctrine. The narrative remains calm. No catastrophe looms yet. The island still stands, ordered and magnificent. But the foundations of balance have shifted. Where once abundance supported harmony, it now fuels reach. Where once order restrained desire, it now organizes it. Atlantis has not become corrupt in a dramatic sense. It has become certain, and certainty, once settled, is difficult to question. The listener is invited to rest within this moment, suspended between achievement and consequence. The sea is calm, the city glows, the future feels assured, yet beneath the surface, the quiet redefinition of limits continues, and what is quietly redefined is rarely noticed until it can no longer be restored. For a long time, Atlantis believes that growth and balance can coexist without tension. The city still functions, the land still yields, the laws still stand. From the outside, nothing appears broken, and because nothing is broken, nothing feels urgent. Yet, within the rhythm of daily life, subtle changes continue to unfold. They do not announce themselves as problems. They arrive as conveniences, as efficiencies, as reasonable adjustments to a world that has become larger and more complex. The people of Atlantis still speak of virtue, but virtue now lives more in language than in habit. It is referenced in ceremony, praised in speeches, and admired in history. In practice, it competes quietly with comfort, ambition, and success. Earlier generations had understood restraint as a form of wisdom. To take only what was needed was considered strength. Now restraint feels unnecessary, even wasteful. When resources are abundant and opportunities expand, limiting oneself appears irrational. This shift does not occur through debate or reform. It occurs through imitation. People observe what is rewarded and adjust accordingly. Those who expand their influence rise. Those who remain cautious are respected, but not emulated. The social atmosphere grows subtly comparative. Achievement is measured against others rather than against internal standards. The question becomes not, is this enough? But is this more than before? Public recognition follows visible success. Builders, traders, and administrators who deliver expansion are celebrated. Their names circulate. Their homes become landmarks. Their lifestyles set new expectations. These changes influence aspiration. Young citizens imagine futures defined by reach rather than service. Education emphasizes competence and ambition. Moral instruction remains present, but it feels increasingly detached from lived outcomes. Within the governing class, similar shifts take place. Rulers still honor ritual, but ritual becomes symbolic rather than formative. Assemblies proceed efficiently. Judgments are rendered quickly. The weight once carried by deliberation lightens. Decisions increasingly prioritize results. If outcomes appear favorable, methods are rarely questioned. The law remains a reference, but interpretation grows flexible in the face of success. This flexibility is praised as adaptability. Atlantis prides itself on being responsive, capable, modern. The idea of returning to earlier limitations feels regressive. As a result, boundaries blur. Distinctions between public duty and personal gain soften. Opportunities that arise through governance are no longer clearly separated from private advantage. At first, this blending feels harmless. Benefits gained by leaders often return to the city through investment and patronage. The cycle appears mutually reinforcing, but perception matters. When citizens see privilege growing near power, trust subtly shifts. Respect remains, but it is no longer paired with closeness. Distance grows quietly. The city itself reflects this transformation. Neighborhoods once mixed by function and status become more distinct. Areas near harbors and administrative centers grow wealthier and more ornate. Other regions remain stable, but unchanged. These differences are not framed as injustice. They are explained as outcomes of productivity and location. Logic supports them. Emotion adapts. Over time, however, shared experience diminishes. People inhabit the same city, but not the same rhythms. Festivals still gather crowds, but daily life unfolds along increasingly separate paths. This separation affects empathy. When lives diverge, understanding thins. The struggles of one group feel abstract to another. Concern persists, but urgency fades. In earlier times, governance had relied on proximity. Rulers lived among the people, observed their conditions directly, and felt consequences personally. Now, administration relies more on reports, metrics, and summaries. Information travels upward in compressed form. Nuance is lost. Complexity becomes manageable, but also distant. Decisions feel cleaner, but less grounded. No single error defines this period. Atlantis does not fall into cruelty or chaos. Instead, it settles into a refined imbalance, one that is difficult to name precisely because it still functions so well. The idea of justice shifts subtly. Rather than being understood as balance, it becomes associated with stability. As long as order is maintained and prosperity continues, justice is assumed. This assumption allows discomfort to exist without response. Minor grievances accumulate without resolution. They are not severe enough to demand change, but they are numerous enough to alter atmosphere. The moral center of the city dims not through violation, but through neglect. Principles are not rejected, they are deprioritized. Religion, too, adapts. The gods are still honored, but devotion becomes formal. Temples grow grander, offerings richer, yet personal reverence grows quieter. Sacred spaces impress more than they instruct. Rituals inspire awe rather than reflection. The divine becomes associated with power and success rather than humility. This shift reinforces existing trends. Prosperity is interpreted as approval. Expansion is seen as alignment with cosmic order. Questioning success feels almost irreverent. As generations pass, memory softens. Stories of earlier restraint sound idealized, even impractical. The past becomes symbolic rather than instructive. Those who remember differently feel increasingly out of step. Their caution is respected but rarely followed. Experience gives way to confidence. The sea remains calm, trade flourishes, the city glows at night. There is no reason to believe that anything essential has been lost, yet something has changed in how Atlantis understands itself. Identity, once rooted in harmony and measure, now centers on capacity and reach. This new identity does not feel false, it feels earned. Atlantis has accomplished much. Its influence is undeniable, but identity, once shifted, reshapes judgment. Choices once unthinkable become reasonable. Actions once delayed become immediate. The island has not yet acted unjustly on a grand scale, but it has adjusted the lens through which justice is viewed, and that adjustment, though subtle, prepares the ground for decisions that will no longer be guided by balance alone. The listener is invited to rest within this quiet transformation. There is no urgency yet, only drift. A drift so gentle that it feels like progress, and progress, when unquestioned, carries its own momentum. Atlantis continues forward, confident and composed, unaware that the measure it once held at its center is slowly slipping out of reach. As the life of Atlantis continues within comfort and continuity, moral attention no longer sharpens around individual decisions, but diffuses gently across routine. The city still believes itself guided by principle, yet principle now moves quietly beneath habit, rarely rising to the surface of conscious choice. What once required reflection is now handled by custom, and what is handled by custom is seldom questioned. In this stage of Atlantean life, actions are rarely evaluated for their meaning. Instead, they are assessed for their effect on stability. If an action preserves order, ensures prosperity, or avoids disruption, it is assumed to be correct. The distinction between what is effective and what is right becomes increasingly faint until the two are treated as interchangeable. Custom begins to act as a substitute for conscience. People no longer ask whether something should be done. They ask whether it has been done before. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates comfort. Over time, comfort dulls the impulse to pause. The rhythm of the city carries individuals forward without asking for deliberate assent. This transformation does not require bad intentions. Most officials, administrators, and rulers still believe they are acting responsibly. They rely on precedent not out of laziness, but out of trust in the system that has served them well for generations. Yet this reliance gradually shifts responsibility away from the self and into the structure. Within councils and assemblies, discussion grows smoother and faster. Agreement forms quickly, not because all perspectives are heard, but because disagreement feels unnecessary. Outcomes are anticipated before debate begins, and debate itself becomes a formality that confirms decisions already made. Those who hesitate are not silenced, they are simply overlooked. Their caution appears excessive in a culture that now equates motion with success. Over time, fewer voices offer restraint, not because restraint is forbidden, but because it is no longer rewarded. The laws of Atlantis still stand unchanged, inscribed and revered, yet their spirit thins as interpretation grows increasingly flexible. Exceptions are made in the name of practicality, and each exception appears reasonable on its own. Accumulated together, they quietly reshape the meaning of the law without ever rewriting its words. Rituals continue to mark political life, but their role evolves. Where they once served as moments of moral recentering, they now function as reassurance. Ritual affirms continuity rather than challenge. It blesses decisions already taken rather than calling them into question. The people continue to participate willingly. Festivals remain vibrant, temples impressive, ceremonies carefully observed. Yet beneath the splendor, ritual no longer alters behavior. It comforts rather than instructs, calms rather than corrects. In daily life, most citizens feel little reason for concern. Systems work smoothly, food is plentiful, trade flows, security is visible. For many, the city feels safer and more predictable than ever. Because discomfort is unevenly distributed, it rarely becomes a shared experience. Those who encounter difficulty tend to internalize it. They interpret struggle as personal misfortune rather than structural imbalance. The idea that the system itself might be contributing to their hardship feels distant, even implausible, because the system still appears functional. As a result, shared identity subtly erodes. Atlantis remains one city, but its people increasingly inhabit different versions of it. Lives diverge in rhythm, expectation, and opportunity, even as public language continues to emphasize unity. Governance adapts to this complexity through abstraction. Decisions are based on reports, summaries, and metrics that compress lived reality into manageable forms. These tools increase efficiency, but they also distance decision makers from consequences. When consequences are distant, moral weight lightens. Harm becomes statistical. Suffering becomes indirect. Responsibility disperses across offices, procedures, and departments until no single person feels accountable for outcomes that would once have demanded explanation. In the outer regions, influenced or controlled by Atlantis, this pattern becomes more visible. Local customs are replaced by standardized systems designed for predictability rather than meaning. Order improves, but autonomy diminishes. Resistance appears quietly through delay, withdrawal, or inefficiency. These signals are noticed, but interpreted as temporary obstacles rather than expressions of deeper unease. Administrative responses focus on correction rather than understanding. To ensure stability, oversight increases. Authority becomes more centralized. Enforcement grows more formal. Each measure is justified as provisional, intended only to restore balance. Yet, provisional measures have a way of settling into permanence. Once established, they become part of the system's normal operation, defended by the very stability they help enforce. The language used to describe these changes remains reassuring. Atlantis speaks of protection, coordination, and responsibility. The tone is calm, even benevolent. Coercion is rarely named, though its presence becomes increasingly routine. Within the city, the consequences of enforcement remain largely invisible. Force is applied far from the center, across seas and borders. The comfort of the capital remains uninterrupted, allowing moral cost to remain abstract. This distance enables denial without dishonesty. People do not lie to themselves. They simply do not see. What is unseen requires no response, and what requires no response soon fades from concern. Gradually, Atlantis begins to see itself not only as successful, but as indispensable. Its systems are viewed as necessary for the functioning of the wider world. Its authority feels justified by the order it produces. This belief carries its own momentum. If Atlantis is necessary, then resistance must be misguided. If resistance is misguided, then overcoming it becomes a moral duty. The logic is quiet, seamless, and difficult to interrupt. At this point, the city has not become cruel or chaotic. It remains disciplined, intelligent, and orderly. Its decline, if it can be called that, is not a collapse of capacity, but a narrowing of imagination. Alternatives become harder to conceive. The idea that Atlantis could choose restraint feels unrealistic. Expansion feels like responsibility. Control feels like care. The city no longer questions itself without feeling threatened. Critique sounds like instability. Reflection feels like delay. The pace of action leaves little room for reconsideration. This is the moment when fragility quietly enters the system, because a system that cannot question itself cannot adapt when circumstances change. It can only continue forward. Atlantis now depends more on momentum than on wisdom. Momentum carries power outward, maintaining order even as direction becomes less certain. The structures still hold, but their flexibility has diminished. There is still no catastrophe, no famine, no rebellion within the city walls. The sea remains calm. The streets remain bright. Confidence remains high. Yet beneath this calm surface, pressure accumulates. Pressure created not by malice, but by unexamined success. Pressure formed by habits that no longer remember why they began. The listener is invited to rest within this stillness, to notice how complete and convincing it feels. Nothing appears broken, nothing demands repair, and yet the space for choice has narrowed. Atlantis stands poised within its own certainty, efficient and assured, unaware that when change finally comes, it will no longer arrive through deliberation. It will arrive through necessity. When Atlantis begins to feel resistance, it does not recognize it immediately as such. The city has grown accustomed to movement that meets little opposition, and so the first signs of friction are interpreted not as warning, but as irregularity. Something has slowed, something has failed to align, and the assumption is that the system requires adjustment rather than reflection. At first, resistance appears far from the capital, in regions loosely connected to Atlantean authority, through trade, protection, or administrative oversight. Reports arrive describing delays, disagreements, and local customs that do not integrate smoothly into standardized systems. These reports are read calmly, discussed briefly, and categorized as manageable complications. From the perspective of Atlantis, the logic is clear. Order has brought prosperity. Coordination has reduced chaos. The systems being extended outward have worked reliably at home, and so it seems reasonable to assume they will function elsewhere with sufficient enforcement and time. This assumption carries quiet confidence. Atlantis does not believe itself oppressive. It believes itself corrective. Where disorder appears, it attributes the cause to inefficiency, ignorance, or resistance to progress, rather than to any flaw in its own approach. The language used to describe external regions reflects this mindset. They are spoken of as not yet aligned, still developing, or in transition. These phrases soften the reality of control by framing it as assistance. Power presents itself as guidance. As influence expands, administration follows. Atlantean officials are stationed farther from the capital, tasked with implementing systems of taxation, record-keeping, and security. These officials operate with broad authority, justified by distance and urgency. Their decisions are rarely questioned, as long as outcomes appear stable. Over time, this distance alters perception. Those who govern from afar begin to see the regions they oversee less as communities and more as variables. Human relationships compress into data. Complexity reduces into categories. What cannot be measured becomes invisible. For the people living under this extended influence, the experience feels different. Systems imposed from elsewhere do not carry the weight of shared history or ritual. Rules feel external rather than organic. Compliance becomes obligation rather than participation. At first, most adapt. They adjust routines, learn new expectations, and attempt to navigate the changing structures. Survival and stability still matter more than autonomy. Yet something subtle shifts in their sense of belonging. The systems of Atlantis prioritize efficiency and predictability. Local practices that resist standardization are discouraged or removed. This creates uniformity, but also erasure. Traditions that once shaped identity are now treated as obstacles. Resistance emerges quietly, not through open revolt, but through withdrawal. Cooperation becomes minimal. Enthusiasm fades. Tasks are completed slowly, mechanically, without investment. The system functions, but without loyalty. These signs are reported upward as inefficiencies. The response is procedural. Oversight increases. Rules tighten. Accountability measures expand. Each response is logical within the system's framework. Atlantis does not yet understand that resistance rooted in loss of meaning cannot be corrected through control. It believes compliance can be restored through refinement of process. Naval presence increases near contested regions. Patrols become more frequent. Their stated purpose is deterrence and protection, but their visibility changes the atmosphere. Security becomes a reminder of authority. Within the capital, this shift remains distant. Citizens hear of deployments and regulations, but not of their emotional cost. The sea absorbs the distance. Comfort remains uninterrupted. As a result, public support for expansion continues. There is pride in the reach of the city, admiration for its organizational capacity, and trust in its leadership. The belief that Atlantis brings order to the world remains strong. Within the councils, discussions grow increasingly strategic. Maps are studied, routes optimized, risk assessed. Language becomes abstract, focusing on zones, resources, and stability rather than people. This abstraction allows difficult decisions to be made without discomfort. When resistance increases, enforcement is authorized. When enforcement escalates tension, further enforcement is approved. The system responds to resistance by intensifying itself. Each action is framed as temporary, necessary, and corrective. There is no sense of overreach, only of incomplete implementation. Yet, the emotional distance between center and periphery widens. Those governed by Atlantis begin to see it not as a stabilizing presence, but as an occupying force. Their compliance becomes brittle. Small acts of defiance appear. Goods go missing. Routes are disrupted. Information is withheld. None of these actions threaten Atlantis directly, but they complicate control. These complications are interpreted as challenges to authority. The response is firmness. Flexibility is seen as weakness. Concession feels dangerous. Within Atlantis, this logic appears sound. History has rewarded decisiveness. Success has followed assertion. There is no precedent for retreat. What is missing is memory of restraint as strength. That memory faded generations ago, replaced by confidence in systems and outcomes. As enforcement increases, so does cost. Resources are diverted from civic life toward administration and security. The change is gradual, almost invisible, but cumulative. Public works continue, but their pace slows. Maintenance replaces innovation. The city remains beautiful, but its growth feels heavier, more deliberate. The people do not yet feel deprived. They feel secure. Yet security itself becomes a constant presence. subtly reshaping daily awareness. Guards stand where they once did not. Ships patrol familiar waters more closely. Order feels nearer, more insistent. This proximity alters trust. Trust, once implicit, now requires reassurance. Reassurance requires visibility. Visibility requires force. Atlantis does not see itself as changing, it sees itself responding. But response has direction, and direction has consequence. At this stage, the outward turn of power is complete. Atlantis is no longer expanding through influence alone. It is maintaining itself through control. The city still believes this is temporary, that once alignment is achieved, pressure can ease. That order, once established, will sustain itself. What it does not yet understand is that systems built on control require constant reinforcement. They do not relax naturally, they tighten. The listener is invited to remain within this moment of transition, where action still feels justified and outcome still appears manageable. There is no collapse, only accumulation. Atlantis stands at the edge of a new phase, not marked by dramatic change, but by repetition. The same responses applied again and again with increasing intensity. Resistance has not defeated Atlantis. It has begun to shape it, and in doing so, it has introduced a new rhythm into the life of the city, one defined less by balance and more by vigilance, a rhythm that will carry consequences forward, quietly, steadily, and without haste. As vigilance settles into the daily life of Atlantis, it does not arrive as fear, but as attention. The city learns to watch itself and the world around it more closely, measuring movement, tracking patterns, and anticipating disruption before it takes shape. This heightened awareness feels responsible, even mature, like the natural posture of a civilization that understands its own reach. At first, this vigilance seems light. Additional records are kept. Communications are monitored more carefully. Officials are encouraged to report irregularities quickly and clearly. These measures are framed as improvements to coordination rather than as constraints, and most citizens barely notice their introduction. Over time, however, attention becomes expectation. The idea that every process should be observable and every action accountable takes root. Transparency is praised as virtue, even as it slowly reshapes privacy. The boundary between protection and intrusion softens, absorbed into routine. In the outer regions under Atlantean authority, vigilance feels heavier. Surveillance replaces trust. Presence replaces partnership. Local leaders are required to justify decisions that once belonged to communal tradition. Compliance is measured not by harmony, but by absence of resistance. These changes are not implemented with cruelty. They are administered calmly through procedures and documentation. Yet procedure itself becomes a language of dominance, shaping behavior without requiring explicit force. When individuals resist, the response is not anger, but correction. Resistance is treated as error, something to be adjusted rather than understood. This framing removes emotion from conflict, but also removes meaning. Within Atlantis, this methodical approach reinforces confidence. Problems are addressed efficiently. Disorder is contained. The system appears capable of handling any challenge through refinement and repetition. The councils grow accustomed to this rhythm. Decisions are evaluated based on their capacity to reduce uncertainty. Policies that increase predictability are favored even if they limit flexibility. Stability becomes a measurable goal. As stability rises, tolerance for ambiguity falls. Unclear situations feel threatening. Uncertainty demands resolution. The space for patience contracts. This contraction affects thought itself. Citizens begin to internalize vigilance, monitoring their own actions to ensure alignment. Expression grows cautious, not because dissent is forbidden, but because it feels increasingly impractical. Public language becomes precise and careful. Words are chosen to avoid misunderstanding. Debate continues, but within narrowing boundaries. Radical alternatives feel disruptive rather than creative. Education adapts to this environment. Students are trained to analyze systems, manage risk, and optimize outcomes. Reflection on values persists, but as theory rather than practice. Moral inquiry feels distant from daily decision-making. As generations pass, few remember a time when trust preceded oversight. Vigilance feels natural, even comforting. The presence of control reassures, rather than alarms. Yet, reassurance carries a hidden cost. When systems watch constantly, they require constant energy. Resources flow steadily into maintenance of order. Nothing collapses, but nothing rests. The city's pace changes. Movement continues, but with deliberation. Expansion slows, not from restraint, but from complexity. Each new extension requires layers of oversight to sustain what already exists. This complexity creates fragility. A system that depends on continuous monitoring cannot easily absorb surprise. It adapts through tightening rather than through transformation. As resistance persists in distant regions, enforcement becomes more formal. Rules multiply. Penalties standardize. Authority grows increasingly impersonal. Impersonal authority reduces conflict, but also loyalty. People comply without commitment. Obedience replaces participation. Atlantis responds by increasing presence. Administrators rotate more frequently. Patrols become permanent. Infrastructure designed for control expands quietly alongside civic works. Within the capital, life remains orderly and refined. The city still glows at night. Markets still hum. Art still flourishes, though its themes shift subtly toward grandeur and permanence. The people feel proud of their civilization's endurance. They see resilience where others might see rigidity. The absence of crisis confirms their confidence. Yet beneath this surface calm, something essential thins. The capacity for trust, once abundant, is now rationed. The willingness to risk uncertainty fades. This loss does not feel like loss. It feels like maturity. Atlantis believes it has outgrown innocence. The sea, once a symbol of openness, now feels like boundary. Routes are guarded, passage is regulated, movement is permitted, not assumed. With each regulation, the world feels smaller, not geographically, but imaginatively. Possibility narrows to what can be managed. The city still speaks of harmony, but harmony is now defined as silence. Absence of disruption becomes proof of success. Voices that once might have questioned direction grow quiet not from fear, but from fatigue. To question requires energy, and energy is absorbed by maintenance. Atlantis has not become tyrannical. It has become careful, and care, when absolute, can suffocate without intending to. As vigilance becomes habit, habit becomes identity. The city no longer remembers choosing this path. It simply continues along it. The system reinforces itself through repetition. Each cycle of control justifies the next. Each response confirms the need for response. The listener is invited to notice how complete this transformation feels. Nothing dramatic has occurred. No walls have fallen. No flames have risen. Yet the city now lives within a narrowed world, one shaped by caution rather than curiosity. Atlantis stands stable, secure, and watchful. And watchfulness, once embraced, rarely loosens its grip on its own. The pressure beneath order continues to build, not from chaos, but from constraint, waiting quietly for the moment when the system, stretched and vigilant, will encounter something it cannot anticipate, something that cannot be managed through repetition, something that will demand more than vigilance, something that will demand change. As the structures of vigilance and control settle fully into the life of Atlantis, the city enters a period that feels stable, even accomplished. Nothing dramatic announces this phase. There is no declaration, no reform, no visible turning point. Instead, continuity itself becomes the defining feature of existence, steady and unbroken, carrying the city forward through repetition. Atlantis now lives inside systems that rarely pause. Administration flows without interruption. Oversight continues day and night. Routes are monitored, records updated, procedures refined. The machinery of order works so smoothly that its motion fades into the background of daily life. Like a sound heard so often, it no longer registers. For the people of the city, this constancy brings reassurance. Predictability reduces anxiety. When outcomes can be anticipated, life feels manageable. The sense of being protected by an immense and capable structure allows individuals to focus on their private concerns without fear of sudden disruption. Yet constancy also carries weight. Systems that never rest require those within them to adapt continuously. Attention must be sustained. Compliance must be maintained. Over time, this effort accumulates quietly, not as panic or distress, but as fatigue. This fatigue is not immediately recognized. It does not manifest as complaint or rebellion. It appears as subtle withdrawal of enthusiasm. Tasks are completed correctly, but without energy. Initiative diminishes. Creativity narrows to what is safe and acceptable. In earlier times, participation in civic life had carried a sense of shared purpose. People felt connected to outcomes, aware that their choices mattered. Now, participation feels procedural. Roles are fulfilled because they exist, not because they inspire. Within governance, a similar shift unfolds. Officials remain competent and disciplined, but their work becomes increasingly repetitive. Decisions follow established patterns. Innovation is rare, not because it is forbidden, but because it introduces uncertainty into a system optimized for control. The language of leadership reflects this change. Speeches emphasize endurance, resilience, and continuity rather than vision. The future is described not as a place of possibility, but as something to be managed carefully, preserved rather than imagined. As a result, time itself feels different. The city no longer looks forward with anticipation. It looks ahead with caution. Progress is measured by avoidance of failure rather than by pursuit of meaning. The younger generations grow up knowing only this atmosphere. For them, vigilance is normal. Oversight is expected. The idea that systems might trust individuals feels abstract, even irresponsible. They learn to navigate complexity early, adapting their behavior to remain aligned. Education reinforces these expectations. Students are trained to function within structures, to manage information, to optimize processes. They learn efficiency before curiosity, reliability before exploration. Reflection is encouraged, but always within defined limits. Those who sense something missing struggle to articulate it. The city still functions well. It still provides. Questioning its direction feels ungrateful, even disloyal. Gratitude replaces critique. In private moments, individuals experience a quiet longing they cannot easily name. Life feels full, yet somehow compressed. Options exist, but they feel constrained by invisible boundaries. Art responds subtly to this condition. Works become grand and polished, celebrating permanence, strength, and order. There is beauty, but less vulnerability. Expression feels curated rather than raw. Public spaces remain impressive, meticulously maintained, and carefully monitored. They invite admiration more than interaction. Movement through them feels guided, intentional, contained. The sea, once associated with openness and exploration, now feels regulated. Harbors operate efficiently, but departure and arrival follow strict patterns. Travel feels authorized rather than adventurous. Trade continues, but its rhythm changes. Exchange is predictable, optimized, secure. Risk is minimized. Surprise becomes rare. This reduction of risk contributes to safety, but also to sameness. Days resemble one another. Change arrives slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly. Fatigue deepens, not because life is harsh, but because it demands constant alignment. There is little room for pause, for wandering thought, for unstructured time. Within the outer regions, still under Atlantean influence, exhaustion appears sooner. Compliance has been maintained through vigilance, but loyalty has not returned. Systems hold, but they strain. Reports begin to note increased errors, delays, and resource inefficiencies. These are interpreted as technical issues requiring adjustment rather than as symptoms of deeper wear. The response remains consistent. Refine procedures, increase oversight, redistribute responsibility. Each correction addresses the surface while reinforcing the structure beneath. Atlantis believes it is solving problems, and in a narrow sense, it is. Order is preserved. Stability continues. But the cost of preservation grows. Energy flows steadily into maintenance. leaving less available for renewal. The city becomes excellent at sustaining itself, less capable of reimagining itself. This shift affects identity. Atlantis once defined itself through harmony and balance, later through reach and control. Now, it defines itself through endurance. Endurance is admirable, but it carries a quiet implication that something must be endured. The people sense this, though few speak it aloud. Life feels heavy without being painful, secure without being light. Trust in the system remains strong, but trust in possibility weakens. The idea that things could be otherwise feels distant, almost naive. As this atmosphere settles, resistance elsewhere becomes less surprising. The city expects it. Resistance is no longer a shock. It is a condition to be managed indefinitely. This acceptance marks another subtle shift. When resistance is assumed permanent, vigilance becomes permanent as well. Temporary measures lose their meaning. Atlantis now inhabits a state of sustained readiness, not alarmed, but never relaxed, prepared, but never at ease. The listener is invited to remain within this stillness, to feel the slow accumulation of effort beneath smooth surfaces. Nothing is collapsing, nothing is exploding, yet the city is tired, not of struggle, but of maintenance, not of danger, but of attention. Atlantis continues forward, stable and disciplined, unaware that exhaustion, once embedded in a system, does not disappear through refinement. It waits, quietly, for the moment when endurance will no longer be enough. As exhaustion becomes part of the unspoken atmosphere of Atlantis, it no longer appears as a temporary condition that can be resolved through rest or reform. Instead, it settles into the structure of the city itself, woven quietly into schedules, expectations, and habits. Life continues smoothly, but the effort required to sustain that smoothness grows heavier with each passing season. The people of Atlantis do not speak openly of this weariness because nothing in their lives appears outwardly difficult. Comfort remains, order persists, security is visible and constant. To name exhaustion in such conditions feels inappropriate, even indulgent, and so the feeling remains private, carried silently by individuals who assume it is personal rather than shared. This private fatigue alters behavior in subtle ways. People move more carefully, choosing predictability over experimentation. Risks that once seemed manageable now feel unnecessary. The desire to avoid disruption outweighs the curiosity to explore alternatives. Stability, once a foundation, becomes a boundary. Within families, conversations grow narrower. Practical matters dominate. Dreams are discussed cautiously, framed in terms of feasibility rather than passion. Ambition is still encouraged, but only when it aligns cleanly with existing pathways. Children grow up observing adults who function efficiently but rarely pause. They learn early that life in Atlantis rewards consistency, alignment, and careful adherence to established norms. They absorb these lessons without resistance because the system has already proven itself reliable. As a result, imagination adapts. Creativity becomes technical rather than exploratory. Innovation focuses on improving what exists rather than envisioning what could be different. Change is incremental, safe, and reversible. The city's institutions mirror this mindset. Reforms are designed to optimize rather than transform. Committees review procedures. Metrics are adjusted. Outcomes improve slightly, reinforcing faith in refinement as the solution to every challenge. Yet refinement has limits. Systems perfected beyond a certain point become brittle, sensitive to disturbance. Flexibility fades as precision increases. What once could bend now resists movement. This resistance manifests first as frustration. Minor disruptions cause disproportionate stress. Unexpected events require extensive coordination. Simple adjustments take longer than before. These difficulties are interpreted as complexity rather than warning. The city prides itself on managing complexity, and so complexity becomes proof of sophistication rather than a signal of strain. The leadership of Atlantis remains composed and confident. They are experienced, disciplined, and deeply invested in the system they oversee. Their identity is bound to continuity. To question the system feels like questioning themselves. In council chambers, discussions remain calm and measured. Concerns are acknowledged, categorized, and assigned for review. Solutions are proposed that preserve existing structures while addressing immediate symptoms. What is rarely considered is the possibility that exhaustion itself is structural, that no amount of refinement can restore energy to a system that has forgotten how to rest. The rituals of Atlantis continue, but their emotional impact fades. Ceremonies are executed with precision, yet they no longer renew collective spirit. Participation feels respectful, not transformative. Temples remain grand and luminous, offerings remain generous, yet devotion feels formal, detached from personal reflection. The sacred has become another domain of order, carefully maintained and gently distant. Art reflects this emotional landscape. Works are polished, controlled, and technically masterful. They inspire admiration, but rarely surprise. Beauty is preserved, but vulnerability is rare. Music fills public spaces, steady and harmonious, designed to soothe rather than stir. It blends into the environment, reinforcing calm without provoking emotion. Public gatherings proceed without conflict. Crowds move smoothly. Interaction is courteous. Yet spontaneity feels out of place, as though it might disrupt the carefully maintained equilibrium. In the outer territories, exhaustion takes a different form. Compliance continues, but patience thins. People follow rules because they must, not because they believe in them. The distance between obedience and loyalty grows wider. Reports of minor unrest increase, not rebellion, but disengagement. Productivity declines slightly. Errors become more frequent. Motivation wanes. Atlantis responds as it always has, by reinforcing oversight. More inspections, more procedures, more documentation. Each response restores surface order while deepening fatigue beneath. The capital remains insulated from these effects. Its streets are clean, its institutions efficient, its citizens safe. The cost of control is paid elsewhere, making it easier to ignore. Yet even within the city, subtle signs emerge. Maintenance becomes constant. Infrastructure requires more attention. The system consumes more energy simply to remain stable. The pace of life slows. not deliberately, but because everything requires careful coordination. Progress feels heavy. Movement requires permission. People begin to speak nostalgically of earlier times, though few can describe them clearly. The past becomes a feeling rather than a memory, associated with lightness, openness, and ease. This nostalgia does not inspire change. It inspires longing without direction. The city lacks a language for renewal. Endurance remains the highest virtue. To persist without disruption is praised. To adapt radically feels dangerous. The idea of rest is associated with vulnerability. Atlantis now exists in a state of continuous effort. It is strong, organized, and capable. Yet it carries itself like a structure supporting immense weight, holding firm through tension rather than balance. The sea remains calm, but its symbolism has shifted. It is no longer an invitation. It is a boundary to be managed. The listener is invited to feel the stillness of this moment, the quiet heaviness that accompanies stability sustained for too long. Nothing is wrong, and yet nothing feels light. Atlantis does not sense an ending approaching. It senses only the need to continue, and continuation, when driven by fatigue rather than purpose, prepares the ground for change that arrives from outside intention. The city rests within its endurance, unaware that endurance alone cannot restore what has slowly been spent. Energy, once depleted, does not return through discipline. It returns through renewal, and renewal has not yet found a place in Atlantis. As the centuries moved forward and human knowledge expanded, the story of Atlantis entered a new phase, one shaped not by philosophers or mystics, but by scientists, archaeologists, and researchers committed to systematic investigation. The Lost Island, once a moral allegory and later a spiritual symbol, now faced the slow, methodical gaze of modern inquiry. This transition did not happen suddenly, nor did it silence speculation overnight. Instead, it unfolded gradually as new tools, disciplines, and standards reshaped how humanity approached the ancient past. By the early 20th century, archaeology had begun to transform from a gentleman's pastime into a rigorous scientific discipline. Excavations were no longer driven by treasure hunting or romantic assumptions, but by careful documentation, stratigraphy, and comparative analysis. Each layer of soil was treated as a record of time, each artifact as a piece of a larger, interconnected puzzle. Within this framework, the question of Atlantis shifted from imaginative possibility to testable claim, subject to evidence rather than belief. The first major challenge facing Atlantis theories was the simple but powerful absence of material remains. Unlike known ancient civilizations, which left behind cities, tools, inscriptions, and burial sites, Atlantis produced no artifacts that could be reliably identified, dated, and placed within a clear cultural context. This absence did not immediately end speculation, but it forced researchers to confront a fundamental problem. Advanced civilizations leave traces, and the deeper the investigation went, the more visible this pattern became. As archaeological knowledge expanded across the Mediterranean, researchers uncovered a tapestry of Bronze Age cultures that were once unknown or poorly understood. Civilizations such as the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, and Egyptians emerged with increasing clarity. each revealing complex societies shaped by trade, technology, and belief. These discoveries initially reignited hopes that Atlantis might be hidden among them, waiting to be recognized under a different name or distorted memory. Yet, as excavation methods improved, the differences became as important as the similarities. Each civilization could be traced through clear developmental stages, showing gradual growth, transformation, and decline. Their technologies evolved incrementally, their cities expanded over generations, and their collapses, while sometimes dramatic, followed patterns consistent with environmental stress, warfare, or economic disruption. None displayed the sudden, total disappearance described in Plato's account, nor the global reach attributed to Atlantis. At the same time, geology began to assert its quiet authority over the debate. Advances in earth sciences provided new understanding of how continents move, oceans form, and land masses change over immense timescales. The idea that a continent-sized civilization could sink rapidly beneath the Atlantic Ocean conflicted increasingly with what geologists observed in the structure of the Earth's crust. Plate tectonics revealed a world shaped by slow motion rather than sudden collapse, where oceans widen over millions of years instead of swallowing continents overnight. Oceanographic surveys further deepened this challenge. As sonar mapping technologies scanned the Atlantic seafloor, they revealed vast plains, ridges, and volcanic formations, but no traces of submerged cities or continental remnants. The ocean floor appeared ancient and stable, shaped by processes that long predated human history. Each new map, each sediment core extracted from the depths, quietly narrowed the space in which Atlantis could plausibly exist. Despite these findings, the search did not simply stop. Instead, it adapted. Some researchers turned their attention to coastal regions that had been flooded after the last ice age, when rising sea levels submerged vast areas of continental shelf. This line of inquiry acknowledged a more modest possibility that ancient coastal communities, rather than a global empire, might have been lost to the sea, their memory preserved and exaggerated through centuries of storytelling. This idea aligned with growing evidence that early human populations had indeed lived along now submerged shorelines. Fishing villages, seasonal camps, and early agricultural sites may have disappeared beneath rising waters, leaving gaps in the archaeological record. However, these communities, while significant, did not resemble the monumental civilization described by Plato. They lacked the scale, organization, and technological complexity associated with Atlantis, reinforcing the distinction between plausible prehistory and mythic narrative. Radiocarbon dating introduced yet another layer of clarity. By measuring the decay of radioactive carbon in organic materials, scientists could establish timelines with unprecedented accuracy. Dates that once relied on guesswork or tradition were now anchored in measurable reality. When applied to proposed Atlantis-related sites, radiocarbon results consistently placed them either far too recent or far too ancient to match Plato's chronology, dissolving many speculative connections. As standards of evidence became stricter, Atlantis increasingly shifted from an archaeological question to a cultural one. Scholars began to ask not where Atlantis was, but why the story persisted so powerfully across time. The focus turned inward, toward the human tendency to preserve meaning through narrative, especially during periods of uncertainty and transition. Atlantis, in this view, became less a place and more a mirror, reflecting fears, hopes, and moral concerns across generations. The 20th century also witnessed the rise of pseudo-archaeology, a parallel world of inquiry operating outside academic standards. Popular authors, documentary producers, and independent researchers continued to propose new Atlantis locations, often relying on selective evidence or visual resemblance rather than systematic analysis. While these theories attracted wide audiences, they rarely withstood critical scrutiny as they lacked reproducibility and methodological transparency. Academic archaeology, by contrast, advanced through collaboration, peer review, and cautious interpretation. Claims required verification, alternative explanations had to be addressed, and conclusions remained provisional. This cautious pace often appeared unsatisfying compared to dramatic narratives of lost continents and hidden knowledge. Yet it steadily built a reliable picture of humanity's past, grounded in physical evidence rather than speculation. Within this framework, Atlantis came to be understood primarily as a philosophical construct. Plato's use of precise numbers, idealized geography, and moral contrast aligned closely with his broader intellectual goals. The story functioned as a controlled thought experiment, illustrating the consequences of virtue and corruption at a civilizational scale. Its power lay not in its factual accuracy, but in its symbolic clarity. Modern scholars increasingly recognized that demanding historical proof from a philosophical myth misunderstood its purpose. Just as no one seeks archaeological evidence for the cave in Plato's Republic, Atlantis need not correspond to a physical site to remain meaningful. Its endurance stemmed from its narrative structure, its emotional resonance, and its adaptability to new contexts. By the end of the 20th century, the scientific consensus had largely settled. Atlantis, as described by Plato, did not exist as a historical civilization. No geological mechanism, archaeological site, or material record supported its literal interpretation. Yet this conclusion did not diminish the story's significance. Instead, it reframed Atlantis as one of humanity's most enduring myths, capable of absorbing new meanings as societies changed. Rather than disappearing under scrutiny, Atlantis transformed. It became a case study in how stories evolve, how memory reshapes events, and how imagination fills the spaces left by uncertainty. In a world increasingly defined by data and measurement, Atlantis remained a reminder that not all truths are empirical, and not all narratives seek verification. Some exist to slow the mind, invite reflection, and quietly explore the fragile balance between power, wisdom, and time. As scientific inquiry gradually set firm boundaries around what could be known, proven, and dated, the story of Atlantis did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it moved into a different domain, one less concerned with excavation and measurement, and more attuned to the inner landscapes of human thought. Atlantis survived not because of evidence, but because of meaning, quietly reshaping itself to meet the psychological and cultural needs of each new era. In the modern world, where information travels faster than reflection, Atlantis found fertile ground within the collective imagination. The lost civilization became a symbolic container for anxieties about progress, decline, and forgotten wisdom. As societies grew more complex and technologically dependent, the idea that an ancient culture might have possessed superior balance, knowledge, or harmony offered a soothing counterpoint to modern uncertainty. Atlantis promised that humanity had once known how to live differently, and perhaps could again. This transformation aligned closely with broader patterns in myth-making. Across cultures, stories of golden ages, followed by catastrophic falls, appear with striking consistency. These narratives offer structure to the experience of loss, framing decline as a moral lesson rather than a random tragedy. Atlantis fits seamlessly into this pattern, presenting a civilization that rose through wisdom and fell through excess, a story that feels intuitively true even when stripped of historical grounding. Psychologically, Atlantis operates as a projection of both longing and warning. It allows individuals to imagine a past in which human potential was fully realized, unfragmented by specialization or disconnection. At the same time, it serves as a cautionary tale, reminding listeners that power without restraint leads inevitably to collapse. This dual function gives the story unusual resilience, allowing it to adapt to changing cultural moods without losing its core structure. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this adaptability became increasingly visible. Atlantis was woven into literature, film, and visual media, where it could be endlessly reimagined without the constraints of evidence. Underwater cities, glowing crystals, and advanced technologies became visual shorthand for lost greatness, reinforcing emotional impact over intellectual rigor. These images, repeated across generations, gradually replaced Plato's restrained philosophical narrative in popular consciousness. The rise of mass media played a crucial role in this shift. Television documentaries, often blending speculation with authoritative presentation, introduced Atlantis to audiences unfamiliar with its philosophical origins. The tone of scientific legitimacy, combined with dramatic reconstructions, blurred the line between hypothesis and fantasy. For many viewers, Atlantis became not a myth to be interpreted, but a mystery to be solved, awaiting only the right discovery to confirm its reality. At the same time, the internet transformed Atlantis from a passive story into an active belief system. Online communities formed around shared interpretations, pooling images, maps, and theories into self-reinforcing frameworks. Within these spaces, skepticism was often interpreted as hostility, and absence of evidence became proof of suppression. The story evolved from narrative into identity, offering belonging and purpose to those who felt excluded from institutional knowledge. This shift highlights an important psychological dimension of Atlantis belief. Humans are not driven solely by facts, but by coherence, meaning, and emotional resonance. The idea that powerful institutions might hide uncomfortable truths resonates deeply with individuals who feel powerless or unheard. Atlantis, framed as forbidden knowledge, becomes a symbol of resistance against perceived authority, regardless of the validity of the claim itself. From a cognitive perspective, the persistence of Atlantis reflects the human tendency toward pattern recognition. The mind naturally seeks connections, especially when confronted with incomplete information. Similar architectural forms, shared mythic motifs, or parallel symbols across cultures can feel too aligned to be coincidental. Without methodological discipline, these perceived patterns easily become narratives of common origin, with Atlantis positioned as the missing link. Modern psychology also recognizes the comfort offered by narratives of cyclical time. In a linear worldview, loss feels final and irreversible. In cyclical narratives, destruction is followed by renewal, collapse by rebirth. Atlantis fits this structure perfectly, allowing individuals to imagine that what was lost might one day return, whether as recovered knowledge, spiritual awakening, or future civilization. This sense of continuity softens the fear of decline. Environmental concerns have further reshaped Atlantis in contemporary imagination. As rising sea levels, climate instability, and ecological degradation dominate public discourse, the image of a civilization swallowed by the ocean feels uncomfortably relevant. Atlantis becomes a mirror for modern anxieties, a story that warns of the consequences of ignoring natural limits. In this interpretation, the lost continent is less about ancient history and more about future possibility. This environmental framing restores, in a subtle way, Plato's original moral intent. While the details differ, the underlying message remains aligned. Civilizations fall not because of fate alone, but because of choices. When harmony between human ambition and ethical restraint is lost, collapse becomes inevitable. Atlantis, reimagined through ecological lenses, continues to serve as a moral narrative adapted to modern conditions. Despite its mythic nature, Atlantis also plays a role in education, though not always intentionally. Its popularity offers educators opportunities to demonstrate the difference between evidence-based reasoning and speculative thinking. By examining Atlantis claims critically, students can learn how scientific methods operate, why peer review matters, and how cognitive biases influence belief. In this sense, Atlantis becomes a teaching tool, not for history, but for epistemology. Yet it is important to recognize that belief in Atlantis is not always rooted in ignorance. For many, it fulfills emotional and existential needs, unmet by purely empirical explanations. The story offers wonder in a world often stripped of mystery, providing a sense of depth beneath the surface of ordinary life. Dismissing this function entirely risks misunderstanding why such narratives endure. The challenge, then, lies in balance. Appreciating Atlantis as myth does not require treating it as history, just as valuing poetry does not require reading it as science. When placed in its proper context, Atlantis can be honored as a profound narrative about human aspiration, limitation, and responsibility. Its value lies not in what it proves, but in what it reveals about the human mind. In this light, Atlantis becomes less a lost place than a recurring idea. It resurfaces whenever societies confront the tension between progress and wisdom, whenever technological power outpaces ethical reflection. Each generation recreates Atlantis in its own image, embedding contemporary fears and hopes into the familiar outline of the ancient tale. As the modern world moves forward, armed with unprecedented tools and facing unprecedented challenges, the story of Atlantis remains quietly relevant. It invites stillness rather than urgency, reflection rather than certainty. It does not demand belief, only attention. In listening to it slowly, without the need to resolve it, the mind finds space to rest within a narrative that has traveled across millennia without ever truly ending. As the story of Atlantis moves further away from the question of physical location, it begins to settle into a quieter and more enduring space. This space is not found beneath oceans or within ruins, but within the inner geography of human memory and imagination. Here, Atlantis exists not as land or stone, but as a structure of thought, shaped by longing, fear, and the persistent desire to believe that something essential has been lost and might one day be recovered. Across centuries, civilizations have repeatedly returned to the idea of a vanished origin, a time when knowledge felt whole and life appeared more coherent. Atlantis becomes one expression of this deep pattern. It is not alone. Similar narratives appear as gardens, golden ages, ancestral homelands, or sacred eras. Each version differs in form, but all point toward the same inward direction, toward a sense of separation from an imagined completeness. In this sense, Atlantis functions less as history and more as memory, even though it is not a memory of lived experience. It behaves like memory, carrying emotional weight without requiring factual precision. The mind accepts it intuitively, not because it happened, but because it feels as though it could have happened. This emotional plausibility grants Atlantis a quiet authority that evidence alone cannot provide. Psychologically, the story aligns with how humans process loss. When something meaningful disappears without clear explanation, the mind fills the gap with narrative. Atlantis provides such a narrative on a civilizational scale. It explains why the present feels fractured by proposing a past that was unified. It reassures by suggesting that confusion is not original, but inherited. This inheritance does not require belief in a literal sunken continent. Even those who dismiss Atlantis as fiction often respond to its symbolism. The image of a sophisticated society undone by its own imbalance resonates because it mirrors individual experience. People recognize the pattern in personal lives, relationships, and institutions. Growth, excess, collapse, and regret are cycles known intimately, scaled upward through the myth. As societies grow more complex, the appeal of such stories intensifies. Complexity creates distance between cause and effect, making responsibility feel abstract. Atlantis restores clarity by condensing consequence into narrative form. It says, gently and without accusation, that choices matter, even when outcomes unfold slowly and indirectly. The slow pace of Atlantis's destruction is essential to its meaning. It is not destroyed in a moment of spectacle, but after long erosion of balance. This mirrors real decline, which rarely announces itself clearly. Instead, it unfolds quietly, normalized by habit, masked by success. Atlantis reminds the listener that collapse often arrives after prolonged stability, not chaos. Within the individual psyche, Atlantis can represent a lost internal state. Many people carry the feeling that something within them was once more whole, more alive, less divided. This feeling may originate in childhood, before responsibility fragmented attention, or in moments of clarity, later obscured by routine. Atlantis gives shape to this sensation, externalizing it into a shared story. Because of this, the myth resists final interpretation. It adapts to the listener's inner condition. To some, it is a warning. To others, a promise. To others still, a mystery meant to remain unresolved. This flexibility allows Atlantis to endure without becoming fixed or exhausted. In modern culture, where meaning is often outsourced to systems and data, Atlantis reintroduces ambiguity. It cannot be solved definitively, and this unsolvability is part of its function. It invites contemplation rather than conclusion. In doing so, it offers rest from the demand to know and master. This contemplative quality aligns closely with sleep narratives. As the mind slows, it becomes more receptive to symbolic coherence than to analytical precision. Atlantis, heard slowly, allows the listener to drift without effort. It does not require attention to details, only presence within the rhythm of its rise and fall. The rhythm itself is gentle, expansion followed by tightening, prosperity followed by strain, confidence followed by imbalance. These movements echo natural cycles: breath, tide, season. Atlantis feels natural because it moves the way life moves, not the way history is recorded. Importantly, Atlantis never asks the listener to intervene. It does not demand action, allegiance, or belief. It unfolds independently, allowing the mind to observe rather than participate. This distance creates safety. The listener can explore ideas of collapse and loss without personal threat. In this way, Atlantis becomes a rehearsal space for difficult thoughts. It allows contemplation of failure without despair, of endings without finality. The ocean that covers it does not erase it completely. It preserves, quiets, and softens. This preservation through concealment is psychologically significant. Hidden things feel protected from judgment. Atlantis, submerged, is spared the scrutiny applied to surviving civilizations. It remains idealized because it cannot be examined fully. Its absence preserves its purity. The ocean itself functions symbolically as the unconscious. What sinks into it does not disappear. It changes state. Atlantis, resting beneath the surface, becomes part of the unseen foundation of thought. It influences without being visible, shaping imagination quietly. Modern reinterpretations often miss this subtlety by focusing on retrieval. They ask how Atlantis can be found, excavated, or proven. In doing so, they reverse its symbolic direction. Atlantis was never meant to be recovered physically. Its power lies in remaining just beyond reach. When approached gently, without urgency, the story becomes calming rather than stimulating. It settles the mind by affirming that not everything must be resolved. Some questions are meant to accompany us, not to be answered. This companionship is why Atlantis persists, even as specific theories fail. Each failed location, each disproven claim, leaves the core narrative untouched. The map dissolves, but the meaning remains. In the context of this sleep story, Atlantis no longer belongs to debate or discovery. It belongs to reflection. It becomes a landscape through which the mind can wander slowly, without destination. As the listener rests, Atlantis rests as well, not as a warning shouted across time, but as a quiet presence reminding us that balance matters, that excess carries cost, and that even the most luminous achievements require humility to endure. Nothing more is required of the listener now. The story continues, not toward revelation, but toward stillness. As the mind remains with Atlantis a little longer, the story begins to soften further, moving away from its interpretation and toward quiet presence. The outlines of meaning remain, but they no longer ask to be examined closely. Instead, they offer a steady background, like distant waves repeating the same gentle motion without urgency or demand. At this stage, Atlantis no longer functions as a lesson or a warning. It becomes atmosphere. The idea of a great civilization, once whole and later lost, settles into the background of awareness as something familiar and unthreatening. The mind recognizes the pattern without needing to name it. And in this recognition, tension begins to release. This release happens slowly. There is no moment of realization, no conclusion to reach. The story simply continues, and in continuing, it allows the listener to stop striving for resolution. Atlantis does not ask to be solved. It only asks to be carried lightly, like a memory that no longer hurts, but still matters. In this softened state, the distinction between myth and self becomes less important. The listener may notice how easily the story blends with personal experience, how the rise and fall of Atlantis resembles inner rhythms already known, periods of clarity followed by confusion, confidence followed by doubt, expansion followed by retreat. These movements are not failures, they are patterns. Atlantis, in this sense, reassures rather than alarms. It suggests that loss is not an interruption of order, but part of it, What disappears does not vanish without consequence. It becomes quieter, deeper, less visible, but it remains part of the whole. As the mind rests with this idea, the need to hold on to certainty begins to loosen. The story does not insist on belief, and so belief is no longer a concern. One can listen without agreeing or disagreeing, without defending or rejecting. The narrative becomes a place to rest attention rather than direct it. This is the moment where Atlantis fully becomes a sleep story. Its edges blur. The city beneath the sea is no longer detailed or vivid. It is suggested rather than shown. Columns dissolve into shadow. Streets are implied rather than mapped. The ocean above is calm, unbroken, and endlessly patient. The patience of the ocean matters here. It does not rush to cover Atlantis, nor does it seek to preserve it perfectly. It simply rests there, holding what has fallen without judgment. This holding is gentle, consistent, and unchanging. It offers a model for rest itself. In the same way, the listener is invited to rest without expectation. There is nothing left to track, nothing to follow carefully. The story moves forward at a pace slow enough that it no longer feels like movement at all. It feels like floating. Thoughts may still arise, but they do not need to be followed. Like fragments of architecture glimpsed beneath the water, they appear briefly and then fade. The mind does not need to dive after them. The surface remains calm. Atlantis, once a place of ambition and structure, now exists as quiet depth. Its former complexity has simplified into stillness. What was once a network of systems and intentions has become a single presence, steady and unchanging. This transformation mirrors the transition into sleep. Just as the body releases effort gradually, the story releases detail. Just as awareness narrows and softens, the narrative narrows and softens. There is no break between waking and rest, only a gradual descent. The descent is unmarked. There are no thresholds to cross, no signals to notice. The listener drifts, not because of instruction, but because there is nothing left to hold on to. Atlantis has already sunk. There is no urgency to follow it. In this state, even the idea of loss becomes neutral. Atlantis is not mourned. It is accepted. Its disappearance feels complete and peaceful, without drama or regret. This acceptance allows the listener to accept other endings as well, both real and imagined. The mind often resists endings, fearing what comes after. Atlantis suggests that after does not need to be known. The ocean covers the end gently, smoothing its edges until nothing sharp remains. The listener can trust this covering. As the story continues, it becomes repetitive in a comforting way, not through repeated events, but through repeated calm. The same sensations return again and again: depth, quiet, distance, stillness. Each return reinforces rest. Language itself begins to slow. Sentences lengthen slightly, stretching without tension. Words feel less like carriers of meaning and more like soft sounds. The voice, imagined or heard, becomes steady and even without emphasis. In this rhythm, the listener no longer needs to remember what has already been said. Memory relaxes, attention loosens. The story holds continuity on its own, without effort from the listener. Atlantis now exists entirely below the threshold of concern. It does not intrude. It does not surprise. It simply remains, like a deep current far beneath the surface, moving slowly in a way that cannot be felt directly. The listener may notice the body responding. Breathing slows. Muscles release. The weight of the day begins to fade, not because it has been resolved, but because it no longer needs to be carried consciously. This is the quiet work of myth at its most gentle, not to instruct, not to persuade, but to accompany. Atlantis accompanies the listener into rest, offering a story that requires nothing in return. There is no final image to hold on to, no closing scene to remember. The city beneath the sea does not rise or reveal itself. It remains where it is, complete in its stillness. The listener does not need to stay with it. The story continues, whether or not it is followed. This freedom allows the mind to let go completely. As awareness drifts further, Atlantis becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding quiet. The story dissolves into the same calm that it describes. There is no boundary between narrative and rest. Nothing more needs to happen. The descent is complete, not because something has ended, but because nothing else is required. After Atlantis has fully settled beneath the surface, the story does not end. Instead, it enters a prolonged silence, a wide and quiet span in which nothing dramatic occurs, yet much continues to exist. This silence is not emptiness. It is a state of rest that follows resolution, a space where motion has slowed enough to become almost imperceptible. In this silence, Atlantis no longer acts as a subject to be examined or interpreted. It becomes part of the background of human thought, no longer demanding attention, but remaining available to it, like a distant memory that surfaces only when the mind is unguarded. The idea of Atlantis lingers without insisting on presence. What remains after Atlantis is not regret, nor urgency, nor even curiosity. What remains is a gentle awareness of balance. The story leaves behind the understanding that all systems, no matter how refined, exist within limits that cannot be negotiated indefinitely. This understanding does not arrive as a warning, but as a quiet truth absorbed gradually. In the absence of the city, attention shifts naturally to what continues. The ocean moves. Time passes. Human life unfolds elsewhere, shaped by its own conditions. Atlantis does not interrupt this flow. Its absence becomes part of the continuity rather than a rupture within it. This continuity is important. It suggests that loss does not fracture existence, but alters its texture. What disappears does not take meaning with it. Meaning redistributes itself, becoming less concentrated, more diffuse, and often more stable. Atlantis, once imagined as vast and luminous, now contributes through its silence. It teaches without instruction, simply by having been and no longer being. This is a form of teaching that does not require remembrance. Even when forgotten, it continues to shape perspective. The human mind is particularly receptive to this kind of influence. It absorbs patterns quietly, especially those associated with rest. Stories heard slowly, without demand, settle deeper than those that seek attention aggressively. Atlantis, in its final stillness, becomes one of these deep-set patterns. Over time, the distinction between Atlantis and other narratives of loss begins to blur. It joins a larger constellation of stories about vanished places, ended eras, and irreversible changes. Together, these stories form a gentle framework through which humans understand impermanence. Impermanence, when presented abruptly, often creates anxiety. When presented slowly, as in the story of Atlantis, it creates acceptance. The difference lies not in the idea itself, but in the pace at which it is encountered. Atlantis never rushes its listener toward realization. It allows understanding to arrive gradually or not at all. This lack of insistence is what makes the story restful rather than unsettling. In sleep, the mind naturally seeks narratives that do not demand closure. Open-endedness feels safe when consciousness is soft. Atlantis offers exactly this kind of openness. It does not resolve into a moral statement or a final image. It simply recedes. As the story recedes, it leaves room. This room is important. It is the space where the listener's own thoughts can slow and thin out. The narrative no longer occupies attention fully, and so attention is free to drift. In this drifting, the listener may notice how rarely life offers true endings. Most experiences fade rather than conclude. Relationships change shape. Identities shift. Places transform or are left behind. Atlantis reflects this reality gently, without resistance. The story also removes the need to judge decline. Atlantis does not fail in a way that demands blame. It does not collapse because of a single error or moment of weakness. It dissolves because balance gradually gives way to strain. This framing removes harshness from the idea of ending. In this removal of harshness, the listener may find relief. The fear of making mistakes softens when mistakes are no longer portrayed as singular catastrophes. Atlantis shows that outcomes arise from accumulation, not from isolated acts. This understanding can be deeply calming. It replaces vigilance with patience. Instead of watching for sudden collapse, the mind can rest in gradual awareness. The ocean that covers Atlantis embodies this patience. It does not erase abruptly. It smooths. It settles. It absorbs sharp edges until nothing protrudes. Over time, even memory becomes gentle. In this way, Atlantis becomes less a story about destruction and more a story about quiet integration. What was once separate becomes part of a larger whole. What was once visible becomes background. The listener, resting now, does not need to carry the story forward actively. It continues on its own, dissolving into the same quiet that holds the body and breath. thoughts may slow further, attention may wander or dim. The narrative no longer competes with rest, it supports it. Atlantis, at this stage, no longer even needs to be named. Its presence is felt without reference. It has completed its function simply by existing long enough to allow the mind to release it. This release is subtle. It does not feel like letting go of something important. It feels like setting down something that no longer needs to be held. As the listener settles deeper into rest, the story becomes indistinguishable from the rhythm of breathing, in and out, slow and steady, no urgency. There is no anticipation of what comes next. Section follows section only in structure, not in sensation. The experience is continuous rather than sequential. Atlantis has given all it needs to give. It does not ask to be remembered clearly. It does not ask to be understood fully. It asks only to have been heard slowly. Now, it is enough that it rests, and in resting, it allows the listener to rest as well. When the story of Atlantis has finally said everything it needs to say, what follows is not an ending, but a continuation without effort. There is no final revelation waiting beyond this point, no conclusion that needs to be reached or remembered. The narrative simply becomes quieter, less defined, allowing the listener to remain within it without the need to follow or understand. At this stage, the idea of Atlantis no longer holds a specific shape. It is no longer an island, a city, or even a symbol that needs interpretation. It becomes a soft presence, like a distant thought that drifts through awareness without interrupting it. The mind does not need to picture anything clearly. Vague impressions are enough. The ocean that once covered the city is no longer described. It does not move, does not shimmer, does not conceal. It simply exists as a steady condition, a calm that does not change. This steadiness is important because it gives the mind permission to stop monitoring what happens next. Nothing new is introduced now. The story has already unfolded. What remains is the quiet space that follows understanding. When the mind realizes there is nothing left to resolve, in this space, attention naturally begins to loosen. The listener may notice that thoughts become slower and less distinct. Ideas do not complete themselves. Sentences form and dissolve without conclusion. This is not confusion, but rest. The mind is doing what it does naturally when it no longer needs to stay alert. Atlantis, in this phase, serves no narrative function at all. It does not instruct, warn, or inspire. It rests alongside the listener, equally still. The relationship between story and listener becomes horizontal rather than directional. Nothing moves forward. This lack of movement can feel unfamiliar at first. Many stories train the mind to anticipate, to wait for the next development. Here, anticipation gently fades. The story does not reward attention with novelty. It rewards it with consistency. Consistency creates safety. When nothing unexpected occurs, the nervous system relaxes. The body no longer prepares for change. Muscles soften. Breathing becomes less deliberate. The absence of urgency is not emptiness. It is fullness without effort. The narrative has provided enough structure to hold attention. And now, it releases that structure gradually, like loosening a grip rather than dropping it. The listener does not need to remember Atlantis now. Memory itself begins to relax. Details that were once clear are allowed to blur. This blurring is intentional. It mirrors the way the mind transitions into sleep, preserving the feeling of continuity while releasing precision. In sleep, clarity is not necessary. What matters is rhythm, and the rhythm here is even and unbroken. There are no peaks, no turns, no emphasis. Each sentence carries the same weight, encouraging the mind to drift rather than engage. The idea that something important has been learned or concluded fades away. The story does not leave behind a lesson that must be carried forward. It leaves behind a sensation of completion that does not require explanation. This sensation is subtle. It does not announce itself. It feels like sitting down after a long period of standing without thinking about the act of sitting. The body simply adjusts. Atlantis, once imagined as powerful and complex, now exists as a quiet absence that feels natural. Its disappearance does not feel dramatic. It feels appropriate. Nothing is missing. The listener may notice that the sense of time has softened. Minutes do not pass distinctly. The difference between before and after becomes less relevant. This is a common and welcome shift as the mind moves toward rest. There is no need to follow the narrative thread anymore. It has already woven itself into the background of awareness. The listener does not need to stay with it consciously. It will remain whether attention rests on it or not. This is where sleep stories do their quiet work. They do not pull the listener into sleep. They allow sleep to arrive on its own by removing the need to stay awake. Atlantis, now fully silent, no longer occupies space in thought. It has become part of the environment of rest, like darkness in a room or the steady sound of distant air. If images appear, they are faint and incomplete. If thoughts arise, they pass without attachment. The story does not anchor them. It lets them go. The listener may feel the boundary between listening and drifting begin to soften. Words are still heard, but their meaning is less distinct. Sound matters more than sense. This is intentional. The voice of the story remains calm and even, without variation. It does not attempt to hold attention tightly. It trusts the listener to drift when ready. Nothing in the story resists this drifting. There is no tension to resolve, no curiosity to satisfy. The narrative has already completed its work. Atlantis does not return. It does not rise again. It does not transform into something else. It simply remains where it is, no longer relevant, no longer active. This lack of return is peaceful. It signals that the story is not cyclical in a demanding way. It does not loop. It settles. As awareness continues to soften, the listener may stop distinguishing between sentences. Language becomes texture rather than content. The rhythm continues without interruption. The story does not need to end formally. It does not need a final sentence that signals completion. Completion has already occurred through gradual quiet. Atlantis has become part of the stillness that surrounds sleep. It no longer asks anything of the listener. Nothing more is required now. The mind is free to rest